It's a cool night. Only the crackling fire on the battlefield and the howling wind break the depressing silence. A man with long, wavy hair looked up at the sky and thought about how his life had become a living hell since turning 34. The guy walked, his cloak fluttering, and his thoughts stubbornly did not let him go, forcing him to remember when everything started going wrong, when life itself got off track. The man, remembering his sister, wondered what would have happened if he had found the sword earlier. Perhaps she would not have been sent to the Empire, and he would not have become a monster. If this were to happen, then the beast called I would not exist. Jack thought about his mentor. If things had turned out differently, he would not have met her, would not have changed under her influence, would not have learned what he can do now. The time our hero spent with her was the best, because she brought grace into his life, changing everything. With a smile on his face, the guy said that if he knew he would regret it, he would have behaved better, choosing his words carefully. Steam came out of the young man's mouth as he looked up at the night sky, watching the clouds slowly drift by. The man continued to watch, sitting on the corpse of the fallen knight, but in reality he wanted something else, feeling a longing for lost opportunities. Someone was approaching him from behind. The steps were unusual, as if a crowd of people were walking. Jack turned sharply, looking coldly and angrily at the reason for the disturbance of the silence. The blue-eyed youth quickly approached the man, holding a sword in his hand, anger visible on his face, and there were more warriors behind him. Jack emphasized that he had already said that he would not fight with children. Did the guy really not understand words? The boy pointed the sword at him, noting that he had killed his father. The man was surprised and seemed to feel uneasy about this fact. But then, with a naive smile, he emphasized that he didn't remember anything like that at all, as if trying to divert suspicion from himself. The young man looked at the young man as if he were the last freak and called him a real monster, but with the way his hands were shaking, he was very scared. The man had been told this so often that it no longer affected him, and he responded to these words with indifference, ignoring their meaning. His body continued to fall apart and ache with pain, his muscles were contracting, and his brain was sending a signal that it was time to finish, but he wanted to continue. The young man looked angrily at his interlocutor, waiting for an answer and wanting to quickly avenge his father. But the young man was in no hurry. He wanted to wait just a little longer. The stranger began to talk about his not-so-good and cruel exploits, hearing the boy call him a monster. The interlocutor was not angered by this. On the contrary, with a grin in his voice, he asked the young man if he knew how many people had fallen from his blade. The guy looked down at the ground and was silent. The man said that hundreds of thousands had fallen by his sword, calling the young man ridiculous, and stressed that he was a monster, just like the young man was a man, and there was nothing surprising about it. The boy stands in expensive clothes and he holds the sword inexperiencedly, with a great desire to attack, but is waiting for something. This interested the man, and he decided to ask the name of the young man who so resembled him in his youth. Hearing in response that his name was Jack Stewart, surprise appeared on his face. It seemed that this simply could not be. It was a coincidence because the man's name was also Jack, and he said his name with a small smile. Afterwards, he proudly clarified that he had killed many, but he did not remember anyone with the last name Stewart. And a minute later, he asked whether the stranger's father was really among those he had defeated. The young man's eyes began to water as he said that his father was not a good man, but he needed him. With anger in his voice, the young man said that it was surprising, and then said that it was most likely jealousy. The man stressed that he would not apologize for killing his father, but would provide him with a favor. Pointing his finger at the boy's sword, he undoubtedly ordered him to be killed, confident in his strength and power, leaving no room for objection. The young man stood there in surprise. Would the enemy really just ask to kill him? Thoughts were mixed up in his head, and he couldn't understand what exactly his opponent was aiming for. It seemed like an eternity had passed, but nothing happened. Our hero's green eyes were empty and lifeless. Suddenly, the stranger broke the silence and noted that now was the best time. And then he added that this way the guy could avenge his father and become famous as the man who killed the monster. The stranger admitted that he could have easily gotten out alive, and it didn't matter that he had a broken leg. All this can be fixed, but he has no desire to. The boy's hands were shaking. He could barely hold the sword, feeling cold sweat on his forehead, fear and tension consuming him. It seemed that the blade would reach its target at any moment, and that would be the end of it. The next second, the young man fell to his knees, unable to do anything. Our hero lowered his head, trying to hide his tears and pain so as not to show his own weakness. But he didn't succeed, because the very next second the guy gave vent to his feelings. The astonished stranger looked at his interlocutor with horror, unable to say anything. However, the next moment the man smiled suspiciously, and a couple of seconds later he extended his hand to our hero. Jack Stewart decided to console the young man by saying that even after the murder, he could not live happily. And then he told the guy not to live in regrets, as he himself does. And looking intently into the eyes of his interlocutor, he added, "After all, he is still so young." Surprisingly, Jack felt sorry for the young man, and then he affectionately patted him on the head. The man asked with relief to tell everyone that the war was over and the monster was dead. The young man, crying, finally asks why he, having so much strength, lives like this if he can change his life for the better. Our hero thought for a moment and answered with a rhetorical question as to why he really lived his life like this. The stranger stated that everything turned out as it did. The man had nothing more to say, or he simply did not want to explain. And just a moment later, Jack Stewart began to fall to the ground. Everything around was swimming, and my eyes closed by themselves. The young man noted to himself that he felt like his body was like a balloon letting air out. Everything was like in a fog. The man could hardly comprehend what was happening around him. The stranger felt as if he was forgetting how to breathe, and the sounds around him ceased to exist. He wondered if he could have changed the sad ending as the boy sat over him, crying. The man's last thought was that if he started over, things might change. It was a beautiful garden, with a gazebo and barbed wire in the foreground. However, suddenly the stranger began to fly somewhere. It seemed to him that it was a dream about his childhood, full of vivid memories. His memories included a father who always doubted that he was his son, and the face of a mother who died after he was born. The older sister, who was famous for her beauty even outside the empire, and the older brother did not always get her husband. All his memories returned to him. His name was John Ballantyre, and having forgotten his name, he became a soldier and crossed the entire continent. It was difficult for the young man to understand whether it was a dream or a memory. Jack didn't understand what was happening to them, and so he decided that it wouldn't take long for him to go crazy. Now the guy was in a beautiful country house, and it seemed that nothing bad could happen. In fact, in his past life, the young man started the Second Continental War. Our hero managed to win it, but at what cost? The guy remembered his exploits, which made him a monster, but managed to be a companion to all his goals. Driven by the desire for revenge, the boy destroyed everyone who belonged to the Tulkun family, which dominated the Western continent. Our hero started wars and ended them with victory. Success accompanied all his goals. It was easy for Jack to accept his death because he had no incentive to live, and then his heart began to stop, when suddenly something happened. Looking at the mirror in the room, he tried to understand how he returned to the past. The young man knew that his home was reality, although much was unclear. The boy panicked and wondered how this was even possible, if all this had really happened. His family, the Marquises of Ballantyre, was renowned throughout the Tesla Empire, and he was the third and youngest child in the family. If Jack had been content with the title of young Marquis of the Teslan Empire, he would have lived a good and happy life, but not for the Ballantyre family. It seems that it is all simple, but there was one thing that the guy thought about. By touching the roses, our hero wanted to forget himself and enjoy what was there. And so the boy came to the rose garden. There was an extension on which stood a table with chairs, and roses grew around. The guy knew that the location looked very good on the outside, but in reality it was a place of some kind of exile. Looking at the sky, our hero thought that this place was needed to protect the youngest child. Sitting on the floor of the annex, he continued to think that this place was meant to protect him from the support of his family and vassals. Suddenly, someone's footsteps were heard behind the young man. Jack knew who it was, although he was in no hurry to turn around. It was about the butler who, smiling and dressed in an elegant suit, brought the young master a drink. Butler Ron was always a little devious, but he was the only one who appreciated and supported the young man. The boy jokingly asked if Ron had put poison in his drink, after which the frightened butler began to justify himself that he had not. With horror on his face, the young man began to scream and make excuses. Jack calmed him down and said with a smile that he was joking and thanked him for everything. Ron simply laughed, saying happily that the little master could always count on him. And the next moment the butler turned and walked away. While sipping his drink, our hero thought that there were 11 more people in the garden besides him. One of them was Ron, who brought tomato juice. There were 10 more guards keeping a close eye on him, ready to protect him from any danger. But the guy didn't need anyone else except the butler. And this was a little discouraging to Jack, who sat on the stairs, looked at the sky, and continued to think. It was surprising how difficult everything in life is. Jack realized that this was real, but he couldn't even imagine that he would have a chance to go back to the past. Looking at his hand, where there were no wounds yet, and not even a hint of a heart of lies, He thought that he was only 14 years old. Unlike other children of noble families, he felt like a complete failure. The guy was relaxing peacefully, enjoying his new body. Suddenly, footsteps and the creaking of floorboards were heard behind our hero. Then Jack felt a blow to his head that caused him to stumble forward, stumbling for a moment, losing his balance. The boy grabbed his head in bewilderment, feeling pain, and thought about how much he had relaxed, not noticing the danger. Our hero did not understand what was happening to him. It seemed like it was another bad dream. The dark silhouette that belonged to the stranger had a negative attitude. Jack cried, clutching his head, not knowing what to do next. A glass of tomato juice broke. Even a lion does not touch animals at a watering hole, because the person who broke it is not aware of this rule. Our hero looked down and pondered what he should do. Meanwhile, the boy's elder brother was shouting at him angrily because he didn't like the way he greeted him. The boy looked at Pelon with fury, wanting to beat him up, who was 3 years older, and he, in turn, did not take his eyes off our hero. Jack walked towards him, remembering that it was his brother who was the reason why he couldn't do magic. It's been so many years, and Pelon still irritates him, still causing him anger and disappointment. This time, the young man's eyes showed anger, hatred, and a desire for revenge. So many years had passed, and our hero was still irritated by this young man. The guy said more than once that he could kill his brother at any moment. Unlike his sister, Jack is absolutely useless and cannot handle a sword or know magic. He remembers how he spilled tea on him and called him a brat. And then he added that if the boy decided to study, his brother would consider it a betrayal and destroy him. And laughing, he added that no one knows how life will turn out in the future. Only when Pelon became the head of the family, he said that he would consider Jack a younger brother. With his hands folded on his knees, the young man recalled that he had been weak as a child. That's why many people in his family made fun of the boy. These conversations extended beyond the family. Even the common people mocked him, and most of the rumors were spread by his brother and Count Mentis. It seemed that everyone in the house was against our hero, who was considered a complete loser. The spread of rumors was especially encouraged by his own father and Count Mentis. But I don't care about my brother, it's even funny to look at him after all. The eldest child in the family is a girl. She is the only one Jack can rely on, and the only one who truly cares about him. The sister is 1 year older than Pelon, but since she is a woman, she cannot take on the responsibilities of the head of the family. Her destiny is predetermined from birth. The Marquis's daughter will marry whoever her father likes and will spend her entire life in a small estate. This is how Isabella's life was and will be, but the beauty did not deserve it. Now in front of Jack is a man who is ready to sell his sister to the first man he meets in order to become the head of the family. This young man doesn't care about the feelings of their common sister or about the feelings of other people. He realized that if he killed his brother, he would be doing the world a great service. Pelon didn't like the way his brother looked at him and decided to punish him by hitting him. The guy decided to act with ease and composure, grabbed his hand, stopping the blow. The young man looked at everything that was happening with horror and seemed not to believe his own eyes. The same applied to the guards, who were wary but did not know whether to intervene in the conflict. His gaze showed confidence in his victory over his older brother because he knows combat techniques. The brother did not expect this from him at all. He shouted that he dared, thinking that the younger one would be scared. Jack easily picked up and threw Pelon over his shoulder, despite the age difference. And Pelon in turn did not even have time to react. Pelon flew into the depths of the gazebo, knocking over the table and chairs that were there, creating chaos around him. He looked at the younger one with fear and asked what was wrong with him, because he did not expect to receive resistance. The interlocutor stood and silently looked at his offender. But a moment later, laughing, he offered to give her his hand. He could not hold back an ironic smile. The elder brother stood up and began to accumulate mana, focusing on the energy surrounding him, driven only by anger. Pelon screamed at how his younger brother dared to contradict him. The guards talked among themselves and decided that they weren't going to stop her. It would be less of a problem for them. Jack realized this and told his brother that no one was stopping us. He expected this to happen, and the guards didn't care about him. The enemy thought to himself that he had gotten himself into a funny situation. Suddenly, Ron, without any weapon, covered the boy with his body, asking him not to use mana now. The butler shouted as loudly as ever so that the master could hear him. For a moment, the young man actually froze, but only to take the next step. Pelon became angry at being interrupted and punched the butler in the face. The next minute, the servant fell to the floor, unable to resist the master. Jack glanced at Ron, thinking that he really did have a lot of secrets of his own. The elder brother began to threaten that the younger brother and the butler would die, his voice full of anger. The young man wanted to say something else, but the guy didn't let him do it. The young man continued to mock, asking ironically if Pelon wanted to just deafen him with his scream, his cheeky smile only irritating his brother more. Choking with anger, the ill-wisher decided that it was high time to take out his saber. Jack was clearly enjoying this, playing on the nerves of his brother, who had already begun to draw his sword because he was not going to back down. Suddenly, the older brother slowly but surely began to back away. The guy stood in a stance. He didn't care that his body didn't know what training was and couldn't detect the lie. He looked at his older brother with a thirst for revenge for all the bullying he had to endure throughout his childhood. Our hero thought to himself that he would never back down. Jack knew very well that third circle magic was Pelon's limit, and no matter what sword he used, he was still a child. Having avoided the attack, the young man understood that his brother would never defeat him with such fencing techniques. Sitting on the floor, Ron thought to himself that the young master was doing something stupid. However, he decided that he would not kill Pelon now. He wanted to impress him even more. When he came closer, he suggested to his older brother that he go to the doctor to have his head treated, which made him even more angry. The young man thought to himself that it was difficult for him to fill his entire body with mana. The butler looked at the whole picture with fear, realizing that the situation was getting out of control, and none of the guards were doing anything to stop the fight. The young man jumped, grabbing Pelon's hand and placing his other hand on his face, directing all his energy there. The older brother screamed in pain, not understanding how Jack could do this, because he had never seen his strength. The young man had no intention of stopping, and so he pushed the offender away with all his might once more. Jack glared at his opponent, not a shadow of regret in his gaze. And so that his brother would remember this lesson forever, he pushed him away once more. Pelon passed out, and the boy poked him with his foot to check and asked if he was still alive. The young man sat on the ground and did not move. Jack wondered indifferently what to do next. He wavered between the desire to leave him and the need to decide how to kill him. The young man looked closely at his opponent, thinking over his plan of action. Suddenly, our hero turned away from Ron and walked off somewhere, but he still couldn't come to his senses. At the same time, the guards moved towards the young man in order to intervene. The boy saw one of the guards about to draw his sword from its sheath. But the next minute, Jack raised his hand, making it clear that he was the boss in this garden. The boy ordered the defenders not to approach him unless they wanted to end up like his older brother. Realizing that the younger one was not joking, the guards immediately abandoned their plan. Jack knew now was the time to take on Pelon, and so the very next moment our hero grabbed his opponent by the hair. The guy began to drag his brother, lost in his own thoughts. It seemed that the young man did not care what was happening to him because he was still unconscious. Less than a minute later, our hero was already looking at a small fountain that was right in front of him. Turning to his older brother, the young man noted that the day was hot, and therefore it would be best for him to cool off. Jack began to drown Pelon, wondering how shocked he was that he wasn't even using his accumulated power. The guy looked closely at everything that was happening and at his opponent. Our hero thought about how powerless his brother was that he didn't even resist. But the next minute Pelon tried to get out. Although the young man held him so tightly that it did not work, he floundered in the water, feeling how his strength was leaving him. The guy didn't feel sorry for Pelon because he sent his sister to the Empire at the first bastard he met. The elder brother deliberately poisoned his father in order to become the head of the family. The young man influenced the affairs of the Empire as if he had the right to do so. The result is clear. The house of the Marquis de Balantier was destroyed and wiped off the face of the earth. Jack didn't care about the opportunity to avenge his father and home. He only regretted the opportunity that his sister had given him with her marriage. The young man was angry, and real joy raged within him for what they had done to Isabella. The girl was always very smart and erudite, which was noticed by everyone around her. In addition, the beauty had a wonderful character, thanks to which she easily found a common language with everyone. She had to go to another empire to maintain a good reputation in the family. She did not sacrifice her own dreams, realizing what she was getting into. On the wedding day, she was saddened that there were almost no guests, and she felt lonely despite all her sacrifices for her family. While everyone was having fun, Isabella had no time for it. Sadness settled in her heart. The future chosen one noticed her sadness and asked what was the reason for such sadness. It might seem that he had sincere intentions. The fourth prince turned out to be a real monster, mercilessly telling her that she was not a legal wife, and therefore no one came to see her. The husband ordered me to stand quietly and nod when asked. And then he added that she shouldn't forget to smile, which only made the girl more nervous. The girl resigned herself and listened to him, because she was ready to do anything for the sake of her family. Sacrificed herself, hoping that it would benefit her loved ones. Jack doesn't want to think about it anymore because he starts to get even more angry and has an uncontrollable desire to kill his brother right now. Suddenly, he heard some indistinct words coming from his brother, which caused surprise, forcing the young man to stop and listen carefully. Jack pulled his brother's head out of the water, after which he, gasping for air, looked confused and frightened and began to beg for mercy. The young man was intrigued by Pelon's grimace. After all, he had only seen such a face on people at war who were afraid of death, and such people were encountered all the time. Jack told his brother to think about what his brother was doing to him and offered to help him think more easily. And still holding him by the hair, he asked why he didn't think about it. It must be difficult to be in such a situation. A second later, Jack, with an evil smile, suggested that his brother walk in his shoes to better understand the meaning of family universities. Pelon looked on with fear. The young man began to swing his fist, ready to hit with all his might. He felt the adrenaline boiling in his veins, and at that moment anger overwhelmed him. Ron shouted for him to stop across the entire area, his voice piercing the air like thunder, making Jack think twice about his actions. The butler then came closer and quietly asked the young master to stop, his calm tone contrasting with the tense atmosphere. The guy looked at Ron, saying nothing. Although he tried to calm the situation, he could not change Jack's feelings. For a few more minutes, our hero held his opponent, deciding to take the next step. Suddenly, the young man let go of his brother, although he did not want to at all, but did it because he respected the butler, who treated him well. Jack spoke rudely to the guard, making him very worried after what he saw that he would get it too. And then he put his foot down on Pelon with disdain. The young man ordered his brother, who was still in a deplorable state, to be removed somewhere. Our hero added that the gentleman was alive, and therefore there was no point in worrying. The guard approached Pelon with concern and began asking how he was feeling while Jack calmly dusted off his hands. The butler walked towards the victim, bumping into the young man with his shoulder. The servant did not know what to say to him, so for a while he simply watched the young master. He in turn watched as one of the guards lifted the unfortunate man from the ground. Ron had never seen Jack like this before. He wanted to help, but he didn't know how to properly approach the young man in such a state. Pelon was taken to his mother's estate, who, when she saw him, was horrified and began to lose consciousness. The woman did not understand how Jack Balentier's half-brother and future heir, supported by the forces of the influential Mentis family, could be in such a state. The family was thrown into total disarray after the future holder of the title of Marquis of this family had a broken head and began to be afraid of water. The servants and doctors used all available first aid methods to help the patient. Jack sat in the room sipping hot tea, and Ron faithfully kept him company. The young man picked up a fork to try the strawberry cheesecake, which looked very appetizing. Jack was about to pop the piece of berry that covered the dessert into his mouth with pleasure. The butler looked attentively at his master, but did not dare to start the conversation first. After the incident with his brother, rumors began to spread among the staff of the house, and the atmosphere in the estate became tense. The sister passing by listened with curiosity to the conversations of others, trying to understand what the rumors were about. At first, she quietly approached and, a little shyly, tried to ask what their conversation was about. But soon her curiosity got the better of her, and she asked decisively what they were whispering about. The rumors began to spread further, gaining new details, and finally reached the head of the family. And this was before Pelon was supposed to turn 18, meaning he could have claimed the throne, but now everything is in question. Father ordered that Jack be called to sort out the rumors that had spread among the staff. The man was not going to leave things to chance. It was very important to him. After tasting the cheesecake, Jack thanked the butler for the wonderful dessert. The servant closed his eyes as a sign that his thanks were accepted, but remained silent. The next minute a maid entered the room and turned to Ron. The girl came a little closer to whisper something in the houseworker's ear. The young master was interested in the butler's reaction, and he quietly watched their conversation. After the girl left, Ron told Jack that he needed to go to his father immediately. Our hero placed his hands on the edge of the chair and was about to get up. Seeing that the young master was going somewhere, the servant shouted that he would go with the boy, since he had witnessed the whole situation. The guy assured that he was no longer a little boy and did not need to be protected. Ron didn't understand what had happened to the young master and why he had changed so much lately. The young man bowed politely, indicating that the boy should be as careful as possible with the master. Adjusting his cloak, our hero did not deign to answer, but proudly walked forward. The house was in chaos, as always. Someone was running somewhere, hurrying somewhere. Arriving at the estate where his family lived, the guy felt strange because of the number of people bustling around. It seemed to him that all eyes were focused only on him, as if he had become the center of attention in this crowd. He hadn't felt this way for a long time, and it made him feel unsure and uncomfortable. Our hero felt like he was being looked down upon and actively whispered about behind his back, believing that he was a worthless person. At the same time, the young man walked proudly through the hall because duty demanded it. Jack tried to think that it didn't matter what anyone thought of him, hoping that the conversation with his father would end soon. The next moment, the young man was already standing at the door, which he was about to open. The young man reached out to open it, but the guards blocked the passage with weapons, not allowing him to go further. Our hero looked at his father's defenders, and they stood there impassively and did nothing more. Jack turned to the knight, but receiving no answer, he realized that he was pretending that he was not there. Our hero stood and watched as two men in front of him closed the opening with axes, making it clear that the young man must leave. The young man lightly nudged the guard's leg, but he only looked at him with an angry gaze, not moving from his spot. Jack began asking the defenders if they were mute or deaf. Looking into the eyes of the ill-wisher, our hero thought that before he would have immediately run away from such a look, but not now. And so, with a smile, he threatened the knight to relax his face, or he would cut it in two. Suddenly the guard made a voice and asked again what the young gentleman had just said, but he kicked him again, but harder, to show his intentions. This time the guard crouched in pain. The force of the blow was felt even through his armor. Jack wasted no time, approached, looking at the knight with a challenge, and asked why they weren't dropping him. The guard replied that he couldn't say why they weren't letting him in, to which the guy, with suspicion in his voice, asked if he should just wait. For a moment our hero thought about what to do next, and then he turned around abruptly and began to walk towards himself, to which the knight, surprised, asked where he was going. Standing half-turned, the guy asked again what it was all about, but the interlocutor did not answer, pretending not to hear, after which Jack asked me to tell him that if his father wanted to talk, he should come to him himself. The guards simply watched him go, thinking that the young master had gone crazy because they had never seen such behavior. The head of the family was informed that the boy simply up and left. Hearing such a statement, the Marquis did not understand how his son could do such a thing. At the same time, the servant, justifying himself, noted that it was true. The young man was not let in, and therefore he turned around and walked away. With a smirk on his face, the formidable father declared that he understood everything. And the very next moment, putting down the pen, he stood up from his seat. The man said in a serious tone that the younger one had changed a lot. Jack sat outside, sipping his drink and wondering why his father hadn't come yet, even though he should have. Suddenly, the guy's attention was drawn to some extraneous noise. Although it was getting dark, and it seemed that no one would come to the garden at such a time, this was not so. And then steps were heard, and the young man realized that many people were approaching him, but he remained calm. As Jack continued to sip his drink, he thought that he had just remembered his father when he came to visit him. Along with the husband walked a lot of servants, and next to them walked his wife, the guy's stepmother, with a fastidious face. Having noticed his father, the young man noted to himself that it was clear from his face that he was an old and stubborn donkey. Surprisingly, our hero remembered this man exactly the same in his past life. The head of the family came closer and looked at the guy from above, evaluating him with a disdainful look, as if he were just a child's toy. Our hero reflected on the fact that he was trying to think as if this man did not exist at all, because in his past life, he almost killed his son when he ran away. This is a man who is capable of selling his child for the sake of his own reputation, too greedy for power and too incapable of achieving what he wants. Jack greeted the man angrily, and it looked very disrespectful on his part, because he did not hide his hostility. The father simply looked straight at Jack, asking with displeasure what had happened to the young man who had once been unable to contradict him. Looking askance at his interlocutor, the guy said that he didn't understand what he was talking about. Suddenly, the Marquis intervened in the conversation, accusing the guy of communicating inappropriately with the head of the family. Jack crossed his legs and noted that the delegation had come a long way, so he suggested going inside the building, although the very next moment, the lumbar suggested discussing everything on the spot. And then, for some unknown reason, he threw the plate into the air with all his might. Everyone gathered was surprised and outraged by such impudence, because no one expected such frankness and disdain from the young man. Not even a few seconds passed before the plate shattered into pieces in the air. Everything happened under the influence of the magical power of our hero's father. The head of the family began to accumulate mana in order to take revenge on the impudent man for everything he had done. Jack realized that his father wanted to know if he had developed a heart of lies, and this made the situation even more tense. Suddenly, a man spoke up, seemingly reading his son's thoughts, and with a grin declared that the young man was empty. But he noted that the young man had a talent for martial arts. The boy heard his father's question about why he hadn't shown it before, answering that it just happened that way, but thinking to himself that he hadn't become stronger, as the leader thought, but on the contrary, had become weaker. The conversation was interrupted by the stepmother, who began to shout, accusing him of behaving arrogantly and insolently at such a young age. The head of the family interrupted his stepmother with a gesture, and with cold abstinence, said that he had previously thought that the boy was useless, but it turned out that this was not so. Our hero looked closely at his parent, not knowing what to answer, and then he asked if he was useless. Did that mean he was not worthy of being his son? The man calmly asked if the child really wanted him to acknowledge him as his son. Jack replied coldly that he was not interested, the words spoken with a palpable indifference that only further strained the atmosphere between them. All those gathered watched what was happening in amazement and could not believe that they heard what they heard. And at that moment, the man turned around and was about to leave. In turn, our hero did not understand what all this meant and what the outcome would be. And the outcome was not long in coming because the father said that he understood everything and, demonstrating indifference, headed home. Looking after his departing parent, the boy did not understand why this man had come at all. Finally, Jack turned to his stepmother, but was in no hurry to say what he wanted. But then he noticed with a smile that after everything that had happened, she had wrinkles, and that she needed to take care of her skin. The woman got angry, calling him a bastard, and was unable to influence our hero in any way. And the young man simply smiled, thinking that he was the most ordinary guy, although he was very pleased to look at the Marquise's angry face. The very next minute, the guy, watching his stepmother, began to say something. Jack wished him a good evening with a smile, and with a little irony asked him to convey his apologies to his brother. Finally, the night has come, the time when you can relax and think about something of your own. The very next day, Ron informed the master that Jack had been sentenced to solitary confinement for 20 days for causing a disturbance in the house. The butler hysterically asked what had happened while he was gone, but the young man replied that it was not important and asked him not to shout. And then he added that while the second one was mocking him, the faithful servant did nothing. But now he was angry. I thought to myself about how solitary confinement works. The unpleasant thing was that the young man had previously been exiled to the Rose Garden, and now prison awaited him. Ron suddenly reminded that there was a month of vacation left at the academy, and if so, then what was the point of this conclusion? Without looking up from his work, Jack remained silent as before. However, emerging from his own thoughts, he shouted that he had completely forgotten about it. Since the boy is only 14 years old, he must study at the academy, because all the aristocrats of the Teslan Empire receive their education there. The only exceptions are people with disabilities or people who, for some reason, cannot study. The course lasts 4 years, and begins when the student is 14 years old, so our hero is in his first year of study. The first semester has already ended and summer holidays have begun. Jack was inspired by the thought that he would be a student again and would have to go back to school. The young man remembered his mentor, and therefore decided that he could skip any subject, but not hers. The young man, looking at his drawing, decided not to quarrel with the Marquis over trifles anymore, so that he would not be banned from visiting his alma mater. The guy thought about how he had lived all this time, realizing that he could not understand his past self. Suddenly, the butler asked if the young gentleman had finished painting, watching him work carefully. Jack asked where his solitary punishment would be, trying to figure out what was in store for him. For a few seconds, the faithful servant stood silently, his eyes downcast, not knowing what to say. Seeing the servant's confusion, the boy asked why he was silent. The butler responded sympathetically that there was only one place for imprisonment. And he added that the punishment would take place in a place designated for criminals who had committed offenses on the territory of the Marquis's estate. The young gentleman, a little frightened, tried to find the right words, but nothing came of it. And so I asked again whether they were really talking about prison. Bowing, Ron confirmed that the teenager had understood everything correctly. And again, for a moment, there was an awkward silence in the room. In horror, Jack shouted to the entire estate that the guy would not leave this situation so easily, and that his determination would only grow with each passing day. The academy holidays should not be used only for relaxation, as was evident in the case of Pelan, who had his head smashed. Almost every day since the beginning of the holidays, he attended various events where he met aristocratic families. But Jack has never had anything like this. The official affairs of the Marquises, of course, do not interest him. But what irritated the young man most was not this. but the fact that his relatives noted that there was no place for the guy anywhere. The thought of this made him very angry, causing flashes of anger and despair in his soul. Sitting on the hard couch, the guy mentally called his family the most obscene words. Our hero decided to come to the prison himself, without waiting to be taken away, demonstrating his determination and unwillingness to submit to someone else's will. Handcuffed, Jack knew it wasn't fair, but he couldn't do anything about it. Ron's crying face showed how much pain he was in. His eyes reflected sadness and concern for the young man. The butler did not hide his emotions and was not embarrassed by the display of weakness, because the boy had become almost like family to him over the years of service. Jack quickly ordered the guards to speed up while the butler begged him to watch his health. Sitting on his bed in prison, Jack thought about the conditions of his stay in this place. The teenager turned his gaze to the corner that served as a restroom. After this, our hero carefully examined the plate of food. The young man did not understand why everything was going downhill. Everything indicated that the blanket had not been changed for several decades, and the soup was so bad that even the flies refused to eat it. Solitary confinement gave him more time to think, but the young man considered it an excessive test, which only increased his irritation. The shame is that aristocrats who own land can punish its inhabitants as they please. At the same time, the rich use local laws, not imperial ones, and in fact, on their territory, they have the same rights as the ruler of the empire. Despite the fact that our hero was imprisoned by order of the Marquis, Jack still remained his son and an aristocrat. The teenager did not understand why he was being punished because he did not rebel against his father. The young man thought that perhaps his father had decided to console the wounded second man in this way and at the same time teach Jack a lesson. The boy was sure that his father had come up with a suitable story. Jack Ballantyre, the disgrace of the family, learned forbidden black magic because of his greed. The older brother told the young man to stop, but he did not listen and used magic even on the young man. But despite the fact that the second heir in the family suffered, Palon forgave the stupid teenager. Probably in the minds of the Marquis and Marchioness, such an excuse was created specifically for the public in order to preserve their reputation. But the guy didn't want to continue this story because it disgusted him. Jack felt bored at the thought and lay down on the bed, hoping that his confinement would not last long. Turning over on his side, our hero realized that he could quickly run away from here, but he couldn't for 3 reasons. Closing his eyes, the teenager knew it was all about his sister, Ron, and also his mentor. Besides, Jack realized that he was still too weak to survive alone, 55 kilograms and 165 centimeters tall, and no muscles. The guy knew the rule of survival in the world. The strong devour the weak, the strongest survive, and the weak become food or die. Jack didn't want to start a massacre like in his past life, but he wanted to protect his sister, mentor, and Ron. The young man knew that to do this, he would need time and power, which could be obtained at the academy, since only there could he prepare for future challenges. If everything works out, the teenager will be able to take care of those he loves and values most. Raising his hand and clenching his fist, the teenager knew he had to do everything in his power. Suddenly, the guy sat up on the bed, inspired by some idea. A minute later, the guy told himself that even though he didn't like it, he was rightfully obliged to take what was his. And so Jack persistently tried to create mana, realizing that he was only at the initial stages from the first to the 3rd circle. 4, 6 circle are expert, while magicians of 7, 9 levels are able to manage mana at the highest level. The 10th circle belongs only to those who are called masters or supermen. This is the highest level of magic. Rubbing his hands, Jack decided that he was lucky, since there was no one around. It took him about 2 hours to create the 1st circle, which gave him time to concentrate and think. The teenager remembered that in his past life he began to study mana no earlier than at the age of 17. As he continued his work, the teenager realized that he now felt like a real weakling. The young man managed to expand the magical energy, although he was angry with himself, realizing that he should not be caught doing such a thing. Suddenly the boy heard the sound of a heel, thinking that his stepmother had come to him, but this sound was louder and not so massive, which surprised him. The sound of heels seemed to echo throughout the cold stone prison building. Not much time passed, and the stranger had already approached one of the cameras. Suddenly, the young man heard a woman's voice tenderly call him Jackie, and his heart felt both warmth and anxiety at the same time. The guy quickly jumped out of bed, because in his past life, he could only hear this beautiful voice in a dream. Elizabeth Ballantyre stood right in front of him, almost crying because she was worried about her brother. The girl reached through the bars, placed her hand on Jack's cheek, and asked if he was okay. The guy was surprised, because he finally saw his beloved sister, who remained as beautiful and kind soul as in his memories. The very next moment, the beauty touched her brother's cheek with her hand. The teenager couldn't believe his eyes. He turned to his sister, but didn't say another word. Closing his eyes full of tears, the young man noted that he was incredibly happy. Everything was fine with him. Suddenly, Elizabeth asked why her brother used black magic when she could have taught him simple magic. The interlocutor noted that she was very sorry, and at the same time stated that the young man should have stayed at the academy. And then she started asking why the guy came back home. The girl continued asking questions, but the guy didn't react. He just smiled in surprise, because he hadn't seen her for a long time. The sister again asked worriedly if he was listening to her, because maybe he was not feeling well. Jack replied that he was just glad to see his family member, and then he lowered his head and began to wipe away his tears, although his sister did not understand what had happened. The young man looked at his sister and began to say that he was glad, and that this was all real, and not his nonsense. There was silence for a moment as our hero collected his thoughts to say something important. After this, the teenager resolutely suggested running away. He said they could live in the village and work in the fields together, hoping to leave all their problems behind. Elizabeth's face looked sad, realizing that this was impossible, because their lives were intertwined with responsibilities and demands. Jack added that he knew how the second and his mother treated her, and he was sure that she should not remain under the wrath of the Marquis. Our hero continued to explain that his sister can fall in love and live with whoever her heart tells her to. The girl began to scream, explaining how long one could live under the oppression of the Marquis. The interlocutor was explaining something while her brother looked at Elizabeth in surprise, whom he had seen so angry for the first time. Having calmed down a little, she explained that no matter what their father was like, a man would still remain a man, and there was no point in saying anything bad about him. The sister continued that she knew how her father felt about Jack, but she would try to change the situation. And again she said that the guy shouldn't get upset. Everything will work out somehow. Elizabeth, with a gentle smile, asked him to wait and trust her, repeating the same thing she had told him in her past life. Our hero, touching the girl's hand, decided for himself that somehow he actually returned to the past, and he said out loud that he was incredibly happy to see his sister again. With embarrassment in her voice, the beauty noted that she was very pleased to hear this, because it was incredibly cute. A minute later, the teenager was thinking about something again. Jack stood up, apologizing. He asked the girl to move away from the bars a little, which made her very surprised. Stepping back, the beauty asked what her brother was going to do. But Jack didn't answer. He only stated that Elizabeth was now at a safe distance. And after the brunette moved away, the young man began to use magic, focusing on the energy emanating from his palm. The astonished guest looked at the teenager and could not utter a word. Jack moved his hand towards the grate and began to focus the energy, feeling the magical force envelop the metal. The sister looked at this in surprise, her hair fluttering from the light flow of magical energy released along with the lock. The relative anxiously asked how the guy was able to create a circle and how he managed to destroy the castle, not understanding where such abilities came from. And while Elizabeth stood rooted to the spot, our hero had already begun to stretch out his hands towards her. The guy silently hugged the girl, because he had dreamed of doing this for so long, feeling the peace and warmth that he had so vainly hoped for. Jack asked his sister for forgiveness, hugging her tenderly. The sister was very surprised by such unexpected tenderness, and she froze for a moment, not knowing how to react to her brother's behavior. After that, the brunette anxiously asked what had happened to the guy. Perhaps he had eaten something wrong or something else strange had happened. Elizabeth continued asking if he was sure he was okay, trying to figure out the boy's emotions. Our hero was flattered by such concern, and so, with embarrassment in his voice, the guy declared that everything was fine with him. Jack continued to hug Elizabeth, realizing how long it had been since he had done this. Our hero assured his sister that everything would be different, not like before, remembering what happened in his past life. The young man promised to give the girl the life she truly deserves, a life in which there is happiness. For a while, the brunette sat silently, not understanding how to react to such an attitude. The sister patted her brother on the back, trying to convey her support and understanding. And the boy remembered how he learned the whole truth about the fourth prince, to whom his sister was given, and his heart was filled with anger. In a past life, our hero took a man captive to avenge his sister because Elizabeth's life was complete hell. After the prince confessed, the young man realized that he was in a hopeless situation that left no chance for salvation. It was all about the truth, a very evil truth. She turned out to be more terrible than our hero thought, and made the young man a greater monster than before. The unfortunate captive understood that there would be no mercy for him, although he secretly hoped for it. An enraged Jack asked how an ill-wisher could offend his sister, adding that he would never forgive him. In his past life, our hero ran away at 17. But after another 10 years, nothing has changed. The Tulkun Empire disappeared, and the Teslan Empire became the largest. Of course, the House of Ballantyre continued to exist in name only. Everything was not the same as before, but it didn't matter. After the empire disappeared, her sister was told that her entire family had been imprisoned, and this was a real blow to her. The girl even dropped her cup of coffee in surprise. Elizabeth begged the prince to have mercy on her family, kneeling, with tears in her eyes, hoping for a drop of mercy. But it is necessary to understand that the girl was in a position no higher than a concubine, and so the fourth prince refused her, pushing her away with indifference, declaring that she irritated him with her pleas. But the brunette was not one to give up so easily. Sitting outside in the cold rain, Elizabeth continued to beg for her family to go. She spent 3 days and 3 nights in the cold, not paying attention to the weather conditions, as long as there was a result. After this, the prince nevertheless decided to listen to the unfortunate woman's request. The man extended his hand to help the girl up, but it could not be called a gesture of mercy. This story was told to the entire continent, but in reality, what was happening within the castle walls was something only Jack knew about. Elizabeth continued to thank the prince, declaring that she would do anything, but she fell silent when the man leaned his hand against the wall and leaned over her, making her feel the tension in the air. The ill-wisher said that the beauty had misunderstood something, and he threatened that he could kill her family without hesitation, although not now. Then the gentleman added that if the girl obeyed, everything would end well. After that, the unfortunate girl became a toy for the royal family, which they used for their own games and amusements. In this situation, the recognized wives could not stand aside, and therefore what happened next was obvious. Over time, the fourth prince lost interest in the girl, and the sister literally became a hostage in the annex. Jack couldn't come to terms with this. It was a big blow. Very soon, the Ballantyre house was completely destroyed. After this, our hero made the cruel decision to destroy the entire Tulkun Empire, wanting to avenge his sister and everything she had gone through. It was about the empress, the princess, the wife of the third prince, the wife of the fourth, the families who supported them, and distant relatives. The young man sought to wipe out even a trace of this family from the face of the earth, which he did, leaving behind only ruins and devastation. That was in the past world, and in this one Elizabeth asked her brother to take care of his health, assuring him that she would talk to his father herself. The guy replied with a smile that everything would be fine and asked her not to worry. And he thought to himself that now everything would be completely different, because he would never again make the mistakes of the past. Night enveloped the estate, plunging it into silence and peace under the glow of distant stars. The sister walked up the stairs, thinking about how Jack had changed, because before he would have simply tolerated this kind of treatment. The girl began to remember how her brother quickly hugged her, feeling warmth and sincerity. Looking out the window, the beauty thought that it was even good to finally see her brother so strong and determined. But the fact that he used dark magic upset her a little, because she knew how dangerous such power could be. With the sixth circle, like the girl, she did not feel any traces of this magic at first. But her father had the seventh. It was easier for him. Having visited her father, the beauty asked him to release Jack from prison. In response to the man's question about why she should do this, our heroine noted that her brother had never studied black magic. The girl noted that she was very complicated, and the teenager was vulnerable and weak, and therefore nothing would have worked out for him. Elizabeth knew that her father wanted the truth about Jack to remain unknown to the public. For some time, both interlocutors were silent. The head of the family continued to drink tea while the brunette simply stood in front of him. Suddenly, the girl began to say that everyone knew that Jack was not claiming the role of heir. He did not need it at all. Realizing that her father was unhappy about something, Elizabeth decided to take a short break, hoping that the Marquis would say at least a word. The man, finishing his tea, remained silent, carefully watching his daughter, whose eyes showed disappointment. The interlocutor said that she was a good girl and very smart, proud that she understood the subtle and imperceptible hint. Elizabeth knew that she had long been destined to be a toy that would raise the status of the family, and although she longed for freedom in a real life. While our heroine was thinking about what would happen to her brother if she refused to follow the prepared scenario, her father declared that the younger one was not suitable for their family, and he added that after he came of age, the Marquis would announce to everyone the death of the young man, and would send him away and invent a fictitious name for him. With an enthusiastic exclamation, the brunette asked again what her father had said a couple of seconds ago. With an indifferent look, the head of the family once again noted that he would in fact send the younger one as far away as possible. And turning into a dog, he added that the girl should never forget her duty. With sadness in her eyes, the beauty assured her father that he had nothing to worry about. After this, the man, looking at his surprised daughter, said that it was surprising that Jack beat up Peilan, who had the third circle, while the younger one had none, although he suddenly added that it didn't matter and allowed his daughter to free her brother. Bowing, the brunette sincerely thanked the head of the family for taking pity on the teenager. Having asked permission to leave, the father declared that the girl could go and rest. Hearing the door close behind the beauty, her interlocutor, closing his eyes, seemed to be thinking about something. Elizabeth leaned against the door she had just closed behind her in horror. The beauty trembled but stood silent and motionless, trying to find comfort in the silence. Our heroine remembered how Jack had suggested that she run away, forcing her to imagine how their days would be filled with simple joys, far from the intrigues of the royal court. Looking at her own hands, still standing in the corridor, the beauty said out loud that this could not be done. Crying bitterly, the girl realizes that they should not take such risks, because you can't escape fate. A new day had dawned, and the sun was shining, warming everything around, filling the air with warmth and hope. Jack woke up, stretching and yawning, trying to get some exercise. Turning to himself, the young man complained that after yesterday he had been dreaming of a past life filled with the most unpleasant moments. Putting his feet on the floor, the young man decided that perhaps it was all about the prison that was giving him nightmares. A minute later, some unknown person addressed our hero as the third gentleman. It was a guard who came into the cell and told the boy that they had decided to release him. The young man noticed that the guard addressed him informally and thought that he should enjoy this moment. Jack said he was sorry because it was very nice here, feeling the warmth in his soul mixed with an ironic smile. The young man noticed that the guard had brought him clothes and sincerely thanked him for it, trying to be polite. A moment later, the young man reached for his boot, which the guard clearly had no intention of giving up. Smiling, Jack asked why the guard was doing this, and thought to himself that the ignoramus didn't respect the Marquis' son. The man selfishly replied that there were no shoes, so Jack had to go barefoot, and besides, there was no point in asking unnecessary questions. Our hero was not going to give up so easily, and so he began to egg on this big guy, who did not understand what was happening. The young man, with anger in his voice, asked if he was a friend of this stranger, that he was behaving like this. And then, clenching his fist, he shouted that the guard was obliged to answer as he should, and not as he wanted. And so, concentrating mana in his hand, he swung and hit the bodyguard for his disrespectful attitude towards himself. Not much time passed, and our hero was already standing in front of the entrance to the estate. But the guy didn't have time to go inside because he heard familiar steps behind him. Ron was surprised to see Jack back, his eyes filled with both panic and horror. Hearing the butler ask if the teenager was hurt, he replied that the servants should not worry because he was fine. The young man continued to look attentively at his master. It was clear how worried he was. But a second later, Ron's inquisitive gaze did not hide the bloodstains that were on our hero's collar. And so the butler began to ask if the boy was wounded, to which Jack replied that everything was fine and the blood did not belong to him. The next moment, the young master noticed that after the incident with Peilan, there were more guards in the estate. Ron specified that the house was being watched by 10 guards and 1 knight from the metal blood pen. Looking sadly at the most prominent young man, the teenager asked if it was true that the most prominent man was the knight. The butler noted that the owner understood everything correctly. Jack felt sorry for the knight, because he probably didn't plan to spend his time guarding the heirs of a rich family. Surely this guy had some plans and even dreams of his own. The guard in the pen, who was looking at the teenager suspiciously, had probably already been told why Jack was in prison. Less than a minute later, the man approached the young man and addressed him as a third master. The knight asked him to tell what happened in prison. Watching the guard bow, our hero felt uneasy, because up until that moment, no one had treated him with such respect. The man explained that he had been told about a young man who had attacked a guard, knocked out his right eye, and even broken a finger on one hand. Ron didn't understand what he was talking about, so he asked why the young master would do something like that. Still bowing, the knight noted that he wanted to know why the guy did this to the guard, since he had no right, and abruptly fell silent. Seeing that the young man was smiling, with fear in his voice, the interlocutor asked what the gentleman wanted to say. Our hero, in turn, asked why his interlocutor was talking about this. Covering his face with his hands, the guy began to scan the man standing in front of him. The young man decided that, judging by the movements, position of the legs, and posture, this man was at least in his fourth circle. The guy thought that the blonde guy was just Mentis's dog, without specifying what that meant. Jack unceremoniously asked what was wrong with treating a dog like a dog, which angered the knight. The young man immediately explained that the knight was assigned only for observation and was not given any other orders. And if this is the case, then it is the young man who will have to deal with all the consequences of what is happening. And poking the man in the chest, he added that he should not dare talk about the rights of teenagers, hinting that the knight still had a promotion ahead for good service. Hearing his interlocutor make excuses, fearing that they would deal with him if Jack did something wrong again, he noted that he would not do anything bad if they did not anger him. The guard closed his eyes and politely apologized, realizing the seriousness of the situation. Our hero praised him with a sarcastic smile, saying that he was glad that the man knew how to think. After this, the young man ordered to sort everything out and report when everything was ready. And he added that if any problems arise, the knight should immediately contact the Marquis. And he said sarcastically that he was not going to address the guard as a knight, because he would be a chicken who could chirp when called. Nudged the surprised butler in the back. Our hero told him not to stand still, but to go into the house. And the next moment, Ron was barely keeping up with the master, shouting that he was already coming. The offended knight, left in the garden, reflected on how unfairly he had been treated. Probably for the first time in his life, the young master felt pleased that he had put someone in their place. Suddenly, the boy switched and asked the butler to cook him some meat, noting that after the prison food, he was very hungry. Bowing to the young man, Ron hastened to assure him that everything would be done in the very near future. After some time, various meat dishes, prepared in the best way, were displayed on the table. The guy ate everything with pleasure, enjoying every piece of food. Our hero had not experienced such joy and pleasure for a long time, and so the young man praised and thanked Ron, noting that he was indeed an excellent cook, to which he responded awkwardly. The butler looked at the boy sadly, but continued to remain silent. However, the interlocutor asked what the servant wanted to ask and why he did not dare to say anything. Ron was in no hurry to answer, timidly turning away and saying that everything was fine, and there was no need to worry. Jack looked softly at the butler, knowing that Ron would never dare, and so, spearing a small piece of meat with his fork, he handed it to his butler. The young man smiled and suggested that they eat together, since the portion was still too big. The young man decided it would be better to ask if the man wanted to eat, and then noted once again that there was a lot of food. An awkward silence hung in the room, during which the servant continued to look intently at his master. And so the butler, although he really wanted to, said that he did not think he had the right to share food with the owner. The guy imperiously asked the young man to sit down because he wanted to talk to him about something else. The man reluctantly sat down in the chair, realizing that Jack would not back down if he did not sit down. The conversation turned to Jack's sister. The guy asked how she was, to which the man replied that everything was as usual. The young man looked at the butler with a smile, but was in no hurry to say anything. While twirling spaghetti around his fork, our hero declared that Ron was no fool, and he added that the man, like no one else, understood how hard it was for him, and hinted at this. Looking attentively at his interlocutor, the young man heard the servant remark that he did not understand what the master was talking about. The guy was also in no hurry to continue the conversation, putting spaghetti into his mouth. After this, there was an uncomfortable silence during which no one dared to say anything. Suddenly, our hero started talking about how the butler always cooked excellently, and he began to explain that his childhood was filled with memories of Ron cooking. When the boy didn't have any worries, he would run into the kitchen to check on his friend. But what interested the boy most was whether the butler was preparing anything tasty. Hearing that the servant knew about this, our hero said something that the servant did not even suspect. With a smile on his face, the teenager noted that he wanted to clarify something. After that, Jack said that he knew that the man was a ninth circle magician. The interlocutor was silent for a while, not knowing what to answer to this remark. The young man said that the butler must have known what his mother was like, because he communicated well with her. The guy noted that they said she looked like Elizabeth and therefore was a good person. And a moment later, he stated once again that he had no doubt about it. And again the room fell silent because Ron, with his hands folded in his lap, sat still silently. He added that Ron was trying to protect her and kept quiet. Our hero was in no hurry, so he reached for a cup of tea that was standing nearby. Jack noted that if this were a novel, He would complain about the unrealistic nature of the story about the ninth circle magician, and with a sad look he continued to say that this was the true truth. The young man remembered a rainy day from the past. Then he ran away from home on a horse with Ron by his side, trying to save him from his father's thugs. Our hero understood that they were in a difficult situation. The pursuers were the Knights of the Metal Blood, trying their best to carry out the order. Their commander was a ninth circle swordsman with long black hair and dark skin. Tears mixed with rain flowed down the face of the young man, realizing that they were much weaker. The butler, who loved the boy as his own, was not going to give in so easily, and he paid for it. That day, Ron died protecting our hero with all his might. The guy cried and screamed, but it was all in vain. What happened happened. Jack continued to tell the butler that he had a hard time accepting that he was a ninth circle mage and belonged to his mother's scroll. The most interesting thing is that the teenager's parent was not an ordinary person, and the Marquis did not even suspect it. After a short pause, the young man added that the woman probably hadn't shared this information even with Ron. And again, after a short pause, the young man put the cup on the table. After that, the young man said that he could pretend that nothing like that happened. But for him, the main thing was to understand what kind of person Ron was. The butler bowed his head and asked what the young master wanted from him. And he replied that he could not trust anyone except his servant and his sister, adding that the girl must be protected at all costs. The butler noted that the mistress, at 18 years old, was already a sixth circle mage, and she would be able to protect herself. To which Jack replied that the girl was too kind, and was even ready to sacrifice herself for others. And death for the sake of family and honor is not what he wants for her, it is what one Marquis wants. The guy admitted that he plans to go to the academy in a day, and if everything goes as it should, he does not plan to return. The young man asked Ron to look after Elizabeth for 4 years while he was at the academy, and then he could live his own life. Ron didn't understand how this could happen, because he spent almost all his time serving Jack. But the teenager said that he shouldn't hide behind him, be his shadow. The butler needs to find something to do that he enjoys. And he continued that in 4 years he would learn, become stronger, and would be able to protect his sister himself. The interlocutors continued their conversation, and suddenly someone politely addressed the guy from behind the door. The young man asked with displeasure who dared to distract them from their conversation. A moment later, the sound of shuffling feet and the clanking of armor could be heard. A knight entered and reported that the guard had been given assistance and sent to the hospital. With a displeased look, our hero asked if this was all the information or if the knight had anything else to report. The guard explained that he had made up a good story to justify the young master, saying that the guard Jacoby had accidentally cut off his finger. And a minute later he added, supposedly being in shock, then accidentally bumped into something and lost an eye. With sarcasm in his voice, our hero declared that since the knight was a sycophant of the head of the family, then he probably earned candy for this. The next moment, the guard quickly said his name, James Carter, hoping the boy wouldn't call him Chicken. The hero answered briefly, because he did not care what the man's name was. After this, Jack said that he needed 1 wooden and 1 real sword for fencing training. James immediately stated that it was not his responsibility and he would not do it. Picking up his fork, our hero again addressed the man as if he were a chicken, asking if it was true that he didn't like him. And then Jack suggested to the bodyguard to beat all the stupidity out of him, that is, out of the young master. Ron, hearing such a statement, began to shout at the teenager, making it clear that this was stupid. The knight asked in surprise if he was serious, to which Jack told him to look at his hands. And he added, hinting that he was weak, that the knight would easily defeat the young master. James thought that our hero was asking him to become a mentor and asked about it directly. This made the guy laugh, but he covered his mouth with his hand so that no one would notice. After this, the young man shouted throughout the house that he had never heard such absurdity in his entire life, and asked James to bring the sword. After the man left, Ron reminded him that James had the 4th circle of magic. With sadness in his voice, the servant asked if our hero was confident in his abilities, noting that the teenager could get hurt. The young man asked the butler if he wanted to make a bet on who would win, and after a little hesitation, he said that he personally was interested in who would be stronger, himself or the worthless chicken. Dvoretsky noted that it is better to argue about how many bruises will remain after the fight. This interested the guy, and he asked what Ron could bet. With a thoughtful tone in his voice, the man stated that James was on a completely different level than the young master. Made a displeased face and asked whose side the servant was on. And the very next moment, the teenager proposed a bet. If the chicken hit him at least once, then the butler would win. And he added that the loser will have any wish fulfilled. The interlocutor lowered his gaze and sat silently for a while. thinking about his next steps. And then, with longing and some indifference, he said that if the guy wanted, he could just order. And while Ron continued to explain that he was a servant in the house, our hero thought that it was funny to hear. But Jack emphasized that in this house he could only trust the butler and his sister, pointing at Ron with his fork. There are no other people in this house that the guy can rely on. However, suddenly the interlocutor said that it was impolite to point at a person with cutlery, trying to get away from the topic. The very next minute, Jack noted that if Ron was happy, then there was no need to hide it. He was not very good at it anyway. The young man explained that he was telling the truth, since he was not ordering his people to do anything, but was asking politely. The butler looked at our hero attentively, unable to utter a word, and yet the man could not refuse, which made the guy very happy. Before the interlocutors could finish speaking, someone knocked very loudly on the door, and a minute later, some man in armor sat down on one knee. It was James, leaning over and apologizing because he said he had gone too far with his comments, replying that if the young man needed a coach, he was ready. Looking at the sad young gentleman, the knight apologized, stating that he had behaved impudently. Jack was thinking at this time that indirect insults and direct assault were completely different things, realizing that the person in front of him was afraid of the consequences. Suddenly, our hero suggested going to a deserted place. The young man poked his finger between the man's eyebrows and wanted to say something, but was in no hurry. And after a little hesitation, he asked whether it was true that the knight was afraid of losing to the young master. And the next moment, the teenager was already looking closely into the eyes of his future opponent. James, turning away abruptly, said that he was not really afraid of anything. The interlocutor, with surprise in his eyes, asked again whether this man was really so confident in his own abilities. And without waiting for an answer, he himself stated that he could see it on her face. And the very next minute, Jack asked Ron if he knew where there was a deserted place on the estate. The man did not answer right away. It seemed that such a question had taken him by surprise. Eventually, the butler took them to the basement, where there was plenty of space and weapons. Rejoicing at such freedom, the guy noted that he didn't even know that they had something like that in their basement. And then he asked if Ron himself really practices in this place. Ron explained that his mother built this place for her children. When asked why the guy didn't know about this place, the butler replied that it was because our hero had never done it before. After examining the room, Jack's attention was drawn to one detail. It was very clean inside, despite the fact that the basement had been unused and gathering dust for many years. There was silence for a moment, although despite this, the teenager smiled and was happy with what he saw. The boy thanked Ron for cleaning, as it meant a lot to our hero. The butler didn't know what to say to him, since he didn't seem to be doing anything special, and so he simply smiled sincerely. A minute later, the young man remembered his rival, and therefore addressed him as a chicken. Jack held out his hand, motioning for James to stop standing there and give him the wooden sword. The knight wanted to refuse, but Jack didn't even listen. And so, less than a minute later, the rival gave the young gentleman what he asked for. Jack took the weapon and was determined. It seemed like nothing could stop him. The knight noticed that the third owner knew how to hold a sword, which was already a bad sign for the man. The boy thought that if James knew how many people had fallen by his sword, he would not have smiled so frivolously. Still holding his blade, our hero timidly thanked his opponent for such a compliment. Jack said let the fight begin fairly and began to attack. The opponent looked closely at the young man and seemed not to understand what the teenager was planning. James parried the attack, thinking he had to be careful not to hit his master too hard. Of course, the knight did not want to look weak, but he realized that he was not fighting an equal. But a second later, the sword was under the guard's throat, which shocked Jack's opponent to the maximum. There was silence for a moment. Those gathered did not know what to say. If the situation spoke for itself. Our hero looked closely at his opponent, trying to understand what he was thinking. A moment later, Ron shouted, turning to his master. However, the young man only noted that if it had been a real sword, the man would already be dead. He added that he asked for a fair fight, but unfortunately, this did not happen. The guard was puzzled, not understanding how a young man who had not undergone training could know such techniques. Ron wondered how that was possible, since the knight could easily repel the attack, but Jack managed to get close to his neck. The butler didn't even suspect that at 14 years old, the younger one was capable of such a thing. The servant thought that James would knock the sword out of his master's hands in a moment, and the boy would be frightened and upset. As a result, the teenager will lie on the ground, confused. However, Jack continued to attack and defend with exceptional skill, which amazed the butler even more. His stance, defense, and striking were perfect, and it didn't look like a 14-year-old fighting at all. Ron, watching all this in surprise, realized that if the sword was real, Jack could easily kill the guard. The young man coped with his task perfectly, and it seemed as if he was a natural-born warrior. At the same time, the knight realized that having such a rival was unpleasant. Ron, at the same time, did not understand what had happened to the boy he knew, because he had never seen Jack train with a sword. The butler suggested that it might be natural talent, but even a genius without training would not be able to fight so skillfully. Closing his eyes, the young man decided that he was wrong. The main reason was that even for a genius, this was something grandiose and unrealistic. Meanwhile, Jack asked James how old he was, guessing that he was over 20. With some caution in his voice, the interlocutor admitted that he was 23 years old. But the interrogation did not end there, as our hero asked when the opponent began training with mana, and learned that at 18 years old. And then he stated affirmatively that the man had received his 4th round in 5 years, and thought that perhaps he had talent, but had started training too late. The next moment, the young man decided to scan this man. Jack saw the knight's potential, and decided that if he trained harder, he could reach the 8th circle and become the captain of the knights. Throwing the sword aside, the guy began to walk away somewhere. Our hero decided to take a real weapon, thinking that with his talent, the knight has to babysit a child, meaning himself. Jack, holding a real sword in his hands and ready for the competition, added with a smile that he was starting to like James. After the guard pointed out that the young man could get hurt, he only smiled a little. Although after just a minute covering his eyes with his hand, our hero laughed sincerely. The young man looked closely at his opponent, but was in no hurry to say or do anything. But the next moment, with a smile on his face, he again called the knight a chicken. The guy started to approach him, explaining that there was a difference between confidence and vanity. Interrupting the young gentleman, the guard noted that everything that happened was just an accident. Looking at his opponent, the young man continued to insult this man. The guard didn't like it, but the guy continued telling the chicken to attack. James was furious, so he took it as a challenge. The man began to swing his arm to strike. He was determined to give the guy a beating. Jack noticed that the man immediately rushed into battle. This trait is precisely what prevents him from developing. The young man knocked the sword out of his opponent's hands, causing him to feel fear, because it was a real one in his hands. A moment later, the weapon was lying on the ground, and our hero again put his sword to the enemy's throat. Tension hung in the air. Afterwards, with a smile, the guy reminded that he had already died for the 2nd time today, as if mocking the man. Looking at the young gentleman with horror, James was perplexed as to how the teenager had managed to do the almost impossible. Jack explained that he simply changed the trajectory of the sword. This made the opponent feel like a bad fighter, because he was beaten by a 14-year-old boy. The young man offered to teach the man, noting that it was all about advanced technology. The knight was upset, but he wanted to know more. James said that in that case, he would take a real sword, which our hero did not object to. The next minute, the young man turned to Ron. The young man emphasized that he won their recent argument. Lowering his head, the servant noted that he had nothing against this. At the same time, the guy stated that it remained unchanged and concerns his sister. Ron was silent for a moment, his face looking as tense as possible. Suddenly, the fight continued. James told the owner that now everything would be different, surprising him. The young man stated that the chicken was extremely funny and could use mana. Afterwards, he warned that he would also use it, so that everything would be fair. The man agreed and told him to attack first, so that he could quickly show his master that he was just an arrogant teenager. But in his soul, the knight felt great tension, and at the same time wanted to take revenge for his losses. The guy jumped with his sword, ready to attack from above, surprising his opponent. The man quickly parried the attack, the swords clashing with each other, emitting mana energy until the blade was pointed at the enemy. The next second, James was struggling to hold on to his weapon, which, like him, could fall at any moment. Everyone gathered saw that the enemy could not hold out, and therefore the battle was practically over. Unable to bear it, the man fell powerlessly to the floor, and the sword flew to the side. The young man placed his foot on the armor, demonstrating his superiority. And then he asked if that was all, or if the guard had the strength to continue. The man asked hesitantly if it was true that the young man was on his 3rd round of lies. Then he added that the guy was too strong for the first one. Our hero thought to himself that his opponent would probably be upset to learn that the boy was able to defeat an adult in the 1st round. Mana is usually distributed throughout the body to enhance physical capabilities, but Jack concentrated it in one place. Suddenly, the young man asked the boy if he wanted to officially become a knight, to which he replied that he did not have such a status. Jack thought about it, remembering his father who had a big dog. He was devoted to his master, for such was his destiny. Looking closely at his opponent lying on the ground, our hero was in no hurry to do anything. But then he offered the knight to be his faithful dog and serve under him, assuring him that life would be more interesting. And again there was silence. James, with a blade at his throat, pondering his decision. The man asked fearfully what would be in his favor if he agreed to this proposal. With a businesslike air, the teenager noted that, to begin with, it would probably be more correct to say what a watchdog needs to do. Turning his gaze to the frightened Ron, the guy nevertheless decided that he would not deviate from the topic. And so the young man explained that if James became his dog, he would receive the strength and power he needed. The guard was interested in what he would have to do if he agreed. The guy offered to kill those who stood in his way and protect the teenager. For a while, the frightened opponent looked at our hero in silence. The butler had approximately the same appearance, not daring to say anything. Realizing that there was no time to waste, the knight asked again who exactly he needed to kill. Removing his foot from his attacker's armor, Jack proudly declared that his opponent had thought about it himself and had come to the right conclusion. The guy said the target was his brother, isn't that obvious? Adding that he gives him a day for the chicken to think carefully and choose the right side. After the conversation, everyone went around the estate to think about what had happened. The butler, entering our hero's room, asked him if the guy was being too careless. While sipping his juice, the young man asked again what his servant meant. Ron warned the owner that he shouldn't trust the knight, because he might tell the Marquis everything. Leaning forward a little, the young man, smiling slightly, thought about something. Seeing the smirk on his master's face, Ron stated that it was not the time for Jack to smile, as it would only play into his stepmother's hands. If a woman finds out that her boyfriend is leaving in a day, she might do something bad. The butler noted that she could even kill him, although the young man was not at all worried about this because he learned that the woman would not succeed. Jack reminded him that his father needed him to control his sister, and then he wouldn't be killed. Although this did not make Ron feel any better, the man stubbornly stated that the young master did not know the Marquise well. But Jack continued to note, even if the Marquis allowed her, the guy was already leaving for the academy and didn't see the point in this situation. The young man confidently explains that ill-wishers can only hurt him, but killing him is something that will never happen. The guy remembered that in his past life, many people wanted to kill him, but no one succeeded. Looking at his drink, our hero fell silent for a moment. At one time, Jack was tried to be killed by Lady Harpy, Lord of Orcs, Lord of Dragons, and no one succeeded. And again, he suddenly laughed at the thought that after all this, some woman would be able to destroy him. Jack thanked him for the massage and noted that he needed to exercise more to get his muscles working and stronger. The butler noted with sadness in his voice that he understood everything. Suddenly, our hero turned around a little and addressed Ron, who immediately responded. Jack confidently stated that if he himself did not want to die, then this would not happen, and everyone would be safe. Ron got angry and asked what the gentleman was even thinking about, because his irresponsibility was off the charts and frightening. With a smile, the young man replied that it was better not to know about it. The butler wanted to say something in response, but he couldn't find the words, and so he simply stood there silently. Jack suggested that the servant go after him if he was interested in what would happen on the way. And he noted that, as the interlocutor believed, they could not travel together, since this would disrupt the entire plan, and this could not be allowed. Jack stated that the man should follow the boy at a distance and ensure safety and peace in any situation. The interlocutor, closing his eyes, said that he would do as the young master ordered. Noticing that the boy was in no hurry to leave, the servant asked what else the teenager needed. Jack asked that no one be allowed in, because he was creating the second circle in complete silence. The butler was surprised when he looked at the boy, because he did not expect such a serious request from the child. Ron screamed hysterically that it wasn't as easy to do as it looked. For a moment, the young man thought about it, but then he reassured his faithful butler, noting that for him everything was as simple as pie. The man thought that the guy had gone a little crazy in his fantasies while he was hiding behind the door. James hurried through the estate, thinking about the young man and his extraordinary powers. The man understood that the teenager did not have a first circle skill. Most likely it was a second or maybe even a third circle one. The knight realized that the child had great talent, but asking him to become a tame dog was pure nonsense. Jack has no support from the counts and no personal knights. He is left completely alone. Suddenly it seemed as if it had dawned on James, and he realized that the situation that had happened could not be ignored. The knight remembered how Jack had offered him to become a dog and serve under him, and it had worried him. These were very strange words for a child, so the guard decided to report this to the Marquis and inform him of the threat. The man understood that no matter how talented Jack was, he would never defeat the powerful marquises. The man was so lost in his thoughts that he didn't even notice how the young maids were looking at him. The girls noted for themselves, looking at the knight's smile, that something very good had certainly happened to this man. And he, in turn, was glad that he would be able to curry favor with his masters and earn their trust. In the pink bedroom sat the Marchioness and Elizabeth, the woman talking about how a commoner mother could at least leave the girl a chance for a good life. The Marquise said that the talent and title of Archmage are not as important as it seems to the young lady, because this is not the main thing. The woman selfishly remarked that her appearance was the only thing she had, since no one was interested in anything else, which upset Elizabeth. The beauty looked down at something but continued to remain silent, not knowing what to answer. The Marchioness said not to be sad about this and offered a glass of red wine for the company to lift the spirits. But the girl refused because she couldn't drink in front of the Marquis, which she wasn't embarrassed to say. While drinking wine in one gulp, the woman said that the Duke of Melon's eldest son was interested in Elizabeth, as was the Duke of Ausenbul's middle son. For a moment, the Marquise fell silent, but only to give her interlocutor a break and time to think things over. After this, she angrily noted that the middle son would not be a suitable match for the beauty, because he had other plans. The woman was interested in finding a good candidate, and ordered Elizabeth to take good care of herself in order to please the man. Answering her stepmother's question about whether she had caught her eye on anyone, the girl began to resist in amazement. The Marquise reminded that if the girl had fallen in love with some guy she chose to her liking, she would have had to get rid of him quietly. Suddenly, the woman said that the youngest had found something interesting to do. Elizabeth asked fearfully what, hoping that he hadn't gotten into any trouble. The stepmother said that he decided to lure the knight to his side, although this is funny, because he has long been on the side of his second son. Clenching her fists, Elizabeth didn't know how to react to this, so she remained silent. The woman laughed throughout the room, because she was surprised at how the boy wanted to kill everyone. Such stupidity was funny to her. The girl thought to herself that it was because of his stepmother and father that Jack had such thoughts in the first place. The young lady said out loud that she understood everything. Smiling, the interlocutor noted that her stomach hurt from laughing, and added how good it was that the girl understood her. Standing up from her seat, the woman emphasized that she would look for a suitable partner for the girl so that everything would be right. But the Marchioness, before leaving, decided to remind the girl of one important lesson so that she would never forget it. The beauty felt her stepmother's breath behind her back, and this made her feel uneasy. And then the Marquise said that if she found out about her daughter's meetings with a man, she knew what would happen. The woman began to threaten Milady, who was already very frightened without these threats. Realizing the situation, the young lady replied that the Marquise should not worry, because she knew how it would all end. Finally, the girl was praised and invited to go downstairs because it would soon be time for dinner, so there was no need to linger. With her head down and her hands folded in her lap, Elizabeth sat silently, not daring to say or do anything, knowing that it could reflect on her brother. It was time for the meal, and the maids were busy setting the table and bringing in food so that everyone could eat properly. There were a variety of different and even unusual dishes on the table. The family sat and ate silently, as if there was no one in the room, but everyone was used to it because that was usually how it happened. And then the door opened with a loud bang, which attracted the attention of everyone sitting at the table, and Peylon screamed in fear. Jack ran into the room, saying that everything was fine in the country, so why was there such a depressing atmosphere at the table? The sister looked at her brother with horror and shouted his name with the same fear. At the same time, the head of the family did not utter a word, although he looked at his youngest son with an inquiring gaze. The young man added that he was his father's third son and asked if there really wasn't room for him, since everyone had to dine together. A few minutes earlier, Jack had been thinking that there were two ways to control mana. The first was to distribute it throughout the body, which allowed for increased sensations, intelligence, and strength. The second way is to materialize mana by creating a formula, fireball, ice arrow, demonic fire, and more. The young man was also interested in why people who use magic are divided into knights and wizards, like Ron and James. For a moment, our hero broke away from his thoughts in order to completely and entirely immerse himself in this moment. Jack showed Ron his second circle, coming straight from his heart, wrapping around his body like a silk ribbon. The servant looked at his master carefully but did not dare to say anything to him. After that, the guy lay down on the bed, asking why the butler was looking at him so strangely, to which he replied something about 2 months. Not understanding, The young man asked again what exactly he meant when he learned that Ron had created the second circle in just 2 months. He then praised the man, saying that this was a very quick result, since it takes at least 4 months. The butler remarked that it was strange to hear such a thing from a child who had created a second circle in just 5 hours. Smiling, our hero once again said that Ron had amazing results, and thought to himself that if he had not reincarnated and would have studied so much himself. For some time, the men chatted casually, as if they were old, good friends. But suddenly the guy asked again what time it was. With calmness in his voice, taking his watch out of his pocket, the interlocutor replied that it was already 5:48 p.m. Rising from his seat, Jack acknowledged the fact that it was already too late. Ron offered to cook the guy some steaks, as always, asking if he wanted anything else. Closing his eyes, the young man declared that he did not want anything, and the butler should not worry. The next moment, the guy said out loud that it was time for dinner, therefore everyone would eat. The guy got out of bed and quickly headed towards the door. Turning around, our hero noted with a thoughtful tone in his voice that he simply wanted to tell everyone gathered the news that he was leaving in a day. In the very center of the table stood a delicious baked chicken. The servant stood nearby and carefully watched everything that was happening in the hall at that moment. Our hero had no intention of delaying, and so, without waiting long, he reached for the chicken. Jack began to eat greedily, noting that the food was not only delicious, but also luxurious. At the same time, the guy noted that Ron's cooking was much better and looked appetizing. The stepmother, sitting on the other side of the table, looked angrily at her stepson, but continued to remain silent. When the guy had eaten his fill, he happily told everyone about it, despite the fact that he was an uninvited guest and did not feel any shame. The boy's attention was drawn to his father, who addressed the teenager. The man asked if he had come to say something, knowing that Jack always did that. The guy smiled slyly, hinting at what the head of the family cared about him. And then he cheerfully replied that he wouldn't just come here to eat brazenly and disturb everyone. The Marquis replied, thinking that his son would give in and come here with an invitation, but he was mistaken in this opinion. Jack decided to ask why his father was speaking so badly about him and ruining the atmosphere for everyone at the table. The young man only smiled politely, which irritated the head of the family, but he did not show it, behaving with restraint. Suddenly, the sister intervened in the conversation. The frightened girl suggested that her brother go out and talk to her about everything. But the Marquis raised his hand, ordering his daughter to be silent, since he was interested in listening to the younger one. The man emphasized that his son should speak if there was something important, and if not, he could go to his room and not interfere. Our hero did not dare to say anything. He paused to collect his thoughts. All those gathered noticed the excellent mood of the youngest heir, who demonstrated it with his whole appearance. Looking at his stepmother, the young man said that he was going to the academy tomorrow because he could not be in this terrible environment. The Marquis, with calmness in his voice, said that if his son had decided so, then he could go. No one would stop him. Still smiling, the boy thought to himself that he didn't need anyone's permission at all. Jack thanked his parent, although this politeness was fictitious. But the guy was in no hurry to leave so quickly. Our hero noted that he had forgotten something. Jack's attention shifted to Pei Lan, and as he addressed his brother, he knew that he would certainly be frightened. The boy reminded Pei Lan that he could not drink water because he was afraid of it, and imagined how thirsty he was. Despite the fact that the young man had bullied him throughout his childhood, the young man, of course, insincerely said that he felt sorry for his brother. Clenching his hands into fists, the young man sat silently, unable to say a word. Jack opened a bottle of wine and, saying that it was not water, offered his brother a drink, demonstratively pouring out the drink. The effect was not long in coming, as the boy screamed as loudly as he could. Pei Lan fell off his chair in fright, and his mother came to his defense and began to scold her stepson. Jack simply turned around and added that he had nothing more to say because his stepmother had started scolding him. Pei Lan squatted down, rested his elbows on the table, and hugged his head with his hands, subconsciously protecting himself from his offender. Elizabeth looked at her brother with apprehension, but did not dare to say anything, realizing that it could end badly. The enraged woman called Jack a disgusting freak because he had crossed all boundaries with his actions. She promised that she would never forgive such behavior, and said that the young man should have been thrown out of the house long ago. Our hero, who had practically already left the hall, stood with his back to his stepmother. But suddenly the guy turned around and said that he would eagerly wait to see what the woman decided to do. Despite the fact that the young man had left the room, the Marquise could not calm down, shouting the most offensive words after him. After some time, the maids were discussing how the young master had changed a lot over the past week. The night would have passed quickly and carefree, if not for his sister yelling at Jack for his actions the previous day. It was time to leave, but something was bothering our hero a little. The boy didn't like that the Marquise's son was going to the academy so modestly. However, he was pleased with the comfort of the carriage in which he was traveling, because the journey promised to be long and exhausting. A very suspicious man was riding a horse next to the teenager. It was Réjean, a knight of the Sixth Circle, in charge of the procession. But this man did not even look the young man in the eye, because he was afraid of him. Jack waved his hand at the man with a smile, while thinking that the Marquise had something in mind for him. The guard looked at our hero with fear, not giving a clear answer, but was sure that the young woman knew more than she was saying. A pleasant voice addressed the boy as Jackie and asked if he would be okay. It was Elizabeth, who was sitting on a white horse and asking why she could not go with her brother, to which he replied that everything would be fine. The girl was sure that her stepmother had something in mind and offered to accompany him to be close. Jack assured that he definitely won't die, and his sister knows it. Our hero happily noted that changes were coming that would bring with them a lot. The guy knew that after what happened to him in his past life, he would be able to cope with everything in this one. However, Elizabeth still had a bad feeling, and she decided to take her brother along. After some time, the guy ordered the beauty to return, since she had gone too far. Elizabeth made a displeased face and repeated once again that her brother should be extremely careful. The butler noticed that the young mistress had listened to her brother after all, and therefore turned her horse. And then he asked again if it was true that the owner would be safe, because there was real horror going on at home. The young man calmed him down and reminded him of their agreement. And then he silently said that this evening everything would fall into place and be resolved. Having read this from his lips, the butler meekly agreed, realizing that something important would happen that evening. The carriage continued on its way, and it seemed that nothing unusual would happen, despite the butler's anxiety. However, Réjean became interested in the conversation, trying to hear at least something despite the noise, and remained at a distance so as not to arouse suspicion. Ron knew he couldn't delay, so he said out loud that he would do everything in his power. Our hero, looking out of the carriage, continued to shout for the servant to come back, because somewhere out there his sister was riding alone. The butler left for Elizabeth to protect her, as he had promised his master. As he settled more comfortably in his chair, the boy thought that his friend would be watching the procession from afar, so he would be a witness to what might happen. The young man began to feel sleepy, but before falling asleep, the young man thought that this was all a conditional gift for Ron, who had served faithfully for many years. Yawning, our hero decided that he could rest a little. He had nothing to do anyway. Everyone drove calmly and did their job. Seeing the guy off to the academy, no one suspected the threat that could lie ahead. The guard noticed that Jack had fallen asleep and looked at him intently, as if pondering something important that had been bothering him all day. Night fell, but despite this, the man, as before, carefully studied our hero. Slowly, Jack woke up after a long sleep, feeling his body return to reality. As he got out of the carriage, the boy asked himself why, despite the late hour, no one had woken him up. The staff were hard at work unloading cargo and setting up camp, preparing a place to spend the night, not forgetting about safety. As he exited the carriage, the young man noticed James, who was looking at the boy closely but continued to remain silent. At that moment, it seemed that the blonde had somehow noticeably grown or matured, so menacing was his appearance. The guy looked at his opponent with a searching gaze, trying to understand what he was thinking. Suddenly, our hero broke into a smile as if realizing something. The young man said that he understood which option the chicken had chosen and that it was his choice, and nothing could be done about it in this situation. He continued that he didn't expect anything else from the security guard. So you just have to accept this fact and move on without looking back. All the knights stood opposite Jack, and Regent said that there was no point in making long speeches, since everything had already been decided. Leaning on his cane, our hero noted that he did not understand anything, and therefore he wanted someone to explain it to him. The man said they would camp every night for the 4 days of the trip to the academy, and then fell silent for a moment. Jack didn't understand what the man wanted to say, so he asked him to continue. At the same time, the blonde said that they would break the guy's bones. And when it's time to go further on our journey, they will simply heal our hero with a potion. And he added that the Marquise gave a separate order for the guy. The woman knows that Jack can create circles. Therefore, the knights will destroy them, because this is a danger that they cannot allow. The young man stood and looked attentively at everyone gathered, asking what they were talking about. Destroying the heart's mana circle is like death. Of course it can be restored, but the chance of filling it with mana again is 1 in a million. In addition, shock can leave a person disabled for life, and that is what they want to do to Jack. The ill-wisher explained that James had said that the young man was good with both magic and a sword. But this will not prevent the knights from completing the task. And looking at the guy, he said, "Others may be mistaken, but he knows that Jack is nothing." Taking out his sword, the guard suggested not to resist, since then, it would be even more unpleasant, and the pain would become an unbearable part of his life. Looking at his opponents, the guy realized that he had a big advantage, a lot of experience from his past life. The wounds in our hero's soul still ached. This was all something he had experienced very recently, and therefore could not have simply disappeared. Suddenly, Jack asked if Rona was nearby, and then he began to tell that he spent 10 years in the mountains, which greatly surprised those present. Réjean, holding the sword tightly in his hands, asked what the young master was talking about. But the young man continued to talk about how he met a mentor who taught him a lot. But when I went down after her death, I learned how much had changed since then. The Ballantyre family and the whole country were in ruins. Réjean asked what the gentleman was talking about, because he was only 14 and he was telling some tall tales that were hard to take seriously. Taking out his sword, the boy explained that he didn't care at all who died there or what happened in the Tulan Empire. I was only interested in what happened to my beloved sister. The girl is smart and good. If nothing had happened to her, he would have forgiven everyone. In the meantime, Elizabeth stood on the balcony of the estate, looking at the sky and hoping that everything was okay with Jack. The young man knew for sure that the beauty deserved the best, and that was all her brother wanted to give her. The guard laughed and said that the owner had gone crazy and was talking all sorts of nonsense that was hard to believe. Suddenly, our hero declared that revenge is much sweeter than he previously thought, so much so that it drives him crazy. Jack emphasized that great power and outstanding talent can turn everything upside down, changing this reality forever. Smiling, the young man thought that since he had already irritated the Marquis and Marquis, one broken rib could have made up for it. After this, the guy emphasized that he would still demonstrate what a real storm and outstanding talent looks like. A second later, it seemed as if the young man had gone wild. He knew for sure that he would do everything so that they would finally begin to respect him. The light around them faded, and Jack noted how strong the storm was. Those gathered did not understand what was happening. How could it be that the circle looked so strange? All the knights felt that if they did not kill the young man, they themselves would die. And fear took possession of their hearts, forcing them to act. Jack is sure that a strong, destructive wind will destroy everything in its path, leaving no hope of salvation. He was a teenager, but it seemed like there was no trace of him left because the guy seemed to have been reborn. Suddenly, the ill-wishers pounced on the young master, trying to stop him from facing the mighty force he had summoned. By this time, the chick thought that choosing the second son would be a good idea, but it turned out to be completely different. Looking at the young man, James felt that time was stopping, and this world was coming to an end, because everything around was collapsing. The young man's sword broke and scattered, while only corpses lay nearby. For a while, our hero stood motionless, trying to comprehend everything that had happened just a few minutes ago. Finally, Jack came to his senses a little, and so he called his faithful servant. The butler emerged from the bushes, not understanding what it was and trying to figure out what had happened, but was only interested in why the guy had destroyed the servants. The young gentleman himself seemed not to realize what had happened, and so he simply looked at his interlocutor. The boy tried to say something, but realized that the butler would hardly understand him, and so he fell silent again. The interlocutor was not one of those who were used to asking for information, and therefore waited for the owner to speak himself. Suddenly, Jack announced that this was a fencing technique he had learned in a state of transcendence. The young man added that he could say more, but it was unlikely that Ron would understand what he meant. The servant said that this technique was more like a method of controlling magic than a technique. The next minute, the guy started asking the butler something about the medicine. Before our hero could ask Ron for the potion, he felt pain and his mouth filled with blood. Jack stood there, feeling every breath become more difficult. Ron looked at him in fear and tried to calm down, and the guy simply told him to give him the potion. The very next moment, the servant was in a hurry to open the bottle as quickly as possible. The man gave him the medicine, knowing that everything would work and the owner would stay alive. Afterwards, Jack coughed, spitting out the rest of the potion. The interlocutor noted that if he had not had the potion, the guy would already be dead. Ron looked at the boy with fear as he explained that the servant always had a potion that he was ready to give to Jack. And after a short pause, he added that the butler was the most loyal person the boy had ever known. Suddenly, our hero was transported to the events of his past life when something similar happened. Then Ron did the same, deciding to share the potion to help his friend. Later, Jack noted that he was in a hurry and couldn't say something, but now he can say it. The young man thanked Ron for his help and support, realizing that he would not have coped with this situation without him. And he thought to himself that in the past, he had been a real fool, believing that such simple words were so complex. The butler sadly stated that the young man knew the future and carefully concealed it to avoid unwanted consequences. The man clarified that returning in time was possible, to which Jack confidently confirmed that this was indeed the case. As the guy tries to get up, Ron asks again if everything is okay, carefully observing the condition. Suddenly, our hero clenched his fist, noting that he quickly came to his senses. The young man decided that the potion was expensive, but declared out loud that he was fine. The young man hugged his knees and decided it was time to check if this was really the case. A minute later, the teenager stood up and walked towards the corpse. But our hero was not worried about the one who fell on the battlefield, but about the sword lying nearby. Waving his own jacket, the guy noted that he was fine. The young man slowly approached the knight and looked at him for a while. It was hard to tell what the guy was thinking from his impassive expression. Afterwards, Jack noted that the chicken was dead. Putting his foot on him, the guy continued to say that he wanted to raise something good out of the blonde. But this did not happen, although the interlocutor stated that, as a knight, this man made the right choice. The young man looked at the butler, thinking about the current situation and trying to find a way out. He noted that Ron wasn't even surprised by the return in time. Wasn't he interested in what it was like there? The servant asked again, looking confused. What could be so interesting? The man was interested in the fate of Elizabeth and the Marquis family, but the butler guessed that the family had been destroyed. Looking at Jack's reaction, it seemed like it was a terrible situation, causing fear and anxiety. The guy whispered that he would like the man to pretend that nothing happened, but if he was interested in something, then let him ask. With a smile on his face, the young man asked his interlocutor if he had thought about what he would ask. The butler said with indifference in his voice that he didn't want to know anything. Not expecting such an answer, our hero began to accuse the servant of being too boring. The young man asked if the man was not interested in his future life. Ron scratched his head and supposed that he would probably just live somewhere. The man emphasized that it is not so easy to kill him, because he always has a potion and is a very skilled magician. Hearing that this is not so, Jack looked at his interlocutor skeptically and said that killing Ron was very easy. The servant's face showed concern and sadness, but the guy said there was no need to be upset. The young man emphasized that he was going to rest and climbed into the carriage to continue his sleep, forgetting about everything. Finally, our hero was able to lie down on the seat, cover his face with his hand, and just relax. At that time, Ron approached one of the knights who was lying on the ground. The young man was confused by the open eyes of the deceased, and so the butler decided that they should be closed. The next moment, the servant looked at the dead warrior with some respect. Looking at the corpses that were everywhere, Ron thought that his master had killed 25 people with one attack, although it was hard to call it just an attack. Ron was interested in how the guy destroyed people's hearts without a sword, because it seemed incredible and unusual. Still lying in the carriage, Jack heard someone address him as a master. Ron suddenly turned around, hearing the noise. The butler began to think to himself about what his life had been like in the past, because it was interesting to learn about the events that had happened earlier. Still mentally, the servant wondered if everything would be okay with the young man. The boy did not answer, but it was important for the man to know if everything was okay, because he was interested in the young man's fate in the past. Ron shouted too loudly, and after that the boy woke up, looking around in surprise, trying to understand what happened. Our hero jumped up and grabbed his heart, while the butler asked how the guy was feeling. With horror in his voice, Jack asked the question again, and then stated that severe pain could cause one to lose consciousness. Holding a small bag in his hands, the interlocutor noted with understanding in his voice that he understood everything. Suddenly, the servant showed the knight's collected things, among which were 5 elixirs, 63 gold, and 40 shillings. Our hero looked at Ron in surprise, but continued to remain silent. And then he said that it was surprising that Mentis's boys carried so much money with them. The butler offered to drink the elixir, but the boy calmly refused, explaining that he did not need it yet. Jack held out his hand with 3 elixirs, saying that this was his one. Embarrassed, the interlocutor thought that the potion was not created by alchemy. Of course, these 3 drugs are of average quality, unlike his highest, but this is not so important. Having thanked the gentleman, Ron asked what to do with the corpses, to which the guy replied that they should be left in the forest for the animals to eat. The servant said that the Marcus would think of Jack, who would not be among the dead. The young man did not understand what to suspect him of, and so he asked the butler about it again. But he once again clarified that the Marquis would have a number of questions regarding what happened and who was to blame. With calmness in his voice, our hero replied that his father would not do anything anyway, and therefore it did not matter. However, the interlocutor did not calm down, noting that if he were in the Marquis's place, he would have immediately called his son to him. Then, the boy suggested making a bet about what his father would do if he found out what had happened. Ron refused because he didn't want to lose anymore, but the boy noted that he was very smart. The teenager put his hand under his chin and thought about something. The servant was in no hurry to say anything either. He was silent but smiling. Bowing, the butler said that he believed the young man had his reasons for thinking so, and agreed with his words. The young man asked again if anyone knew that the man was with him in the forest. The interlocutor, closing his eyes, confirmed that this was true. It seemed that the young man was not satisfied with this question, and so he asked again whether the servant was sure of this. The man admitted that he used an illusion, and therefore it seemed to everyone gathered that he was cleaning the garden. Our hero knew that illusion is a magic available to the ninth circle. Those who know how to use it work in the demonic forest. Jack wondered if the Marquis would question Ron about what had happened and what information he could provide. Therefore, he ordered that if there was a threat to life, the young master would be held guilty. In case he wants to kill, convey very important words that the interlocutor is interested in. Jack stated that if Ron or his sister died, the entire Marquis family would be destroyed that same day. Suddenly, an awkward silence fell over the forest, each of the men thinking about something of their own. The young man assured that this was for emergencies, and there was no need to look at him like that, since he was not planning to do this yet. Our hero laughed sincerely, assuring his interlocutor that there was no point in worrying. Looking into the eyes full of sincerity, Ron noted that he hoped that everything would still be okay. The guy said that he would give the Marquis one last chance to be a loving father to his daughter, to prove that he truly appreciates and loves her. Answering the servant's question about whether the boy really needed to go to the academy, the young man answered in the affirmative. Jack stated that the butler knew that the school had its own rules. The teenager said that from the beginning of the semester, unless it was the death of a relative, he couldn't leave. It was clear from the man's face that he wanted to leave with Jack, but he remained true to his duty to protect Elizabeth. Afterwards, the young man joked so that he wouldn't run into any monsters on the way. The butler was worried that they would now only see each other in 4 years, although the guy noted that this was not necessary. And the main condition, that Ron looked after his sister, was critically important for the guy, and determined all further actions. Once Jack was left alone, he began to calculate how long it would take him to get to the academy. And it turned out that from the establishment to the Marquis's estate, you can set up camp on the mountain 3 times. But if you go by road, it will take 4 days, although along the mountain it will take about that. Moreover, the mountain path is no different from the usual road. Picking up his briefcase, the young man thought that he had to make a decision. Afterwards, the guy remembered that there was a village nearby and decided to go there. The young man understood that he couldn't do without a horse, and so he began to figure out the saddle. The very next moment, our hero tried to climb onto the horse, which was quite difficult to do because Jack was short. Having finally accomplished what he had planned, the young man thought that he was not particularly lucky with his external appearance. Lost in thought, the guy didn't pay attention to what was happening around him, although it wasn't necessary. The night was calm and did not foreshadow anything dangerous. Not taking into account what had happened a few hours earlier, Jack decided that he would not go to the academy straight away. Suddenly, the boy remembered his mentor, Valentine Milos, deciding that he should focus on her. The girl brought our hero back to life, gave him the strength to carry out his revenge, and made the young man, whom everyone considered to be nothing, into a man. Although everyone has forgotten about it, Valentine Milos is one of the most powerful black magicians. Jack felt a shudder, something he hadn't felt in a long time, and it bothered him more than anything else. While traveling, the hero came to Abriola, a province of the vassal of Duke Osenbla, which was famous for its natural beauty and mystical legends. Standing in front of the hotel, the young man wondered whether he should stay there for the night or continue on his way. The happy children playing on the sidelines attracted attention. Looking at them, our hero realized that this was a good place to rest and regain his strength. After thinking for a while, the young man made a firm decision. A minute later, the young man entered the tavern, trying to find a warm place where he could eat and rest. Jack saw happy people laughing and sharing stories, which even lifted his spirits. The hungry guy's gaze fell on the delicious-smelling sausages, which smelled deliciously of fire. In front of Jack was a dog who was happy to see our hero, but the guy didn't understand what was wrong with the dog. The dog, as if accompanying the young man, led him to the table, while the young man thought only about not quarreling with anyone here. Suddenly, our hero heard someone's voice behind him, stating the fact that a new guest had arrived. A waitress approached the guy and asked if he had come to have dinner or to rent a room. Jack thought to himself that the employee looked more like some kind of mercenary. The young man asked for water, food, and a room. While sorting through the coins, the teenager added that he had left the sword with the horse and asked to take it to his room. Smiling, the blonde said that 1 shilling would be enough for everything, noting that she would bring steak and apple pie. After that, she suggested drinking beer, to which the guy replied that milk would be enough. As she left, the beauty said that she would be back soon. Looking at the money, the guy thought that, despite the fact that he was not a local, they were not trying to get as much money out of him as possible. Jack, petting the dog, noted that it was not bad here. One could live and stay, and the prices were not high, although this was understandable since it was pre-war time. The dog was friendly, feeling the stranger's trust. The young man turned to the dog, saying that the great little boy had no idea what kind of future awaited him, full of surprises and adventures. But the very next minute, our hero's attention was attracted by something else. At the next table, a group of people were loudly discussing how someone was planning to get rid of all the demonic monsters. People were saying that even Tolkien wasn't doing anything, and there were only 20,000 mana users. And then they added that it seemed like the authorities were laughing at them. Knights were selected from the guards of each noble family and sent out to hunt for metallic blood. This forest stretched across a high, beautiful ridge called the Grand Canyon, which may seem simple. But in reality, there live ogres, orcs, tapestries, elves, harpies, and even dragons. They were killed to make useful things such as potions, armor, bowstrings, and harpy feathers were used for girls' jewelry. Only elves were used as pets because of their appearance. It was all extremely unpleasant. As our hero scratched the dog, he knew that the creatures in that forest were not a threat, so it was all just human greed. The young man knew what others did not suspect, namely that the people would lose this war. Jack remembered that this time, the Metal Blood Knights had lost a third of their men, many knights from aristocratic families. After this, the emperor lost the support of the people from noble families. Jack suggested that this was where the problems in the imperial family began, and a year later, the Civil War. The man at the next table slammed down his beer and emphasized that the problem was the emperor. His friends, not letting him finish, covered his mouth with their hands and asked in panic if he wanted to lose his head. The people sitting at the next table looked at the group of friends with displeasure, noting that they had drunk too much. The boy thought with a sad expression that the boys were fearless because they faced execution for insulting the emperor. Suddenly, the guests started talking about the Marquis's third son. The guys noted that the guy used black magic. One of the men emphasized that this fool was also thrown into prison, and the young man was sitting not far away, indignant. The blonde asked his friends where the third son could have learned black magic, since all the dark magicians had died out. The girl suggested with a smile that perhaps there was one aristocrat left, and the young man learned from him. The waitress came up with a tray and asked what made the guy laugh so much. Looking closely at the food, the young man thought about what the employee had told him. Scratching his cheek, it seemed that our hero could not understand the meaning of these words. Suddenly, Jack realized that he hadn't even noticed how he started laughing, and because of this, he was very surprised. The waitress sat down opposite him and asked if the young man would like to share what he was laughing about, since everyone here was very bored. The girl listened attentively as Jack explained that the Marquis's third son was a great fool, according to rumors. The young man said that the kids in the neighborhood told him a lot of funny things. After this, the blonde said that all people gossip about things that they themselves could not hear or see. Our hero asked how the employee judges people. Laughing, the beauty replied that she had to see everything in person to decide something for herself, and rumors were just rumors. Jack emphasized that rumors are sometimes true, conveying his opinion politely and calmly. The lady, smiling, asked again if this was true, to which the guy answered in the affirmative. The young gentleman picked up a piece of pie that looked very appetizing, with jam flowing out of the soft dough, but the guy thought the dessert wasn't as tasty as Ron's, continuing to enjoy the warm dish. The waitress, with her arms folded, tried to collect her thoughts and start talking about what she thought. The guy looked attentively at his interlocutor but remained silent. The girl winked coquettishly and continued to say that she believed that if the Marquis's third son turned out to be a good person in life, then the rumors were wrong. Our hero, continuing to chew the pie, looked attentively at the employee. The young man was surprised. Something was wrong. Scars on the stranger's face, a pumped-up body, and mercenaries around. The waitress cut the steak to make it more comfortable to eat, but the young man suddenly asked if the blonde was the leader of the Adventurers Guild. For a moment, surprise froze on the stranger's face, but a moment later the beauty began to smile. As Jack took another bite of pie, he knew he wasn't just saying that. There are many mercenaries in the village who are looking for a way to make money. These people can be detectives or become monster hunters, and such tasks are given by the Adventurers Guild. This is why such guilds usually offer housing. The guy said that the girl had too much free time, considering that she had to serve the tavern. The blonde explained that there was little work in the guild, so she spent more time at the inn because she needed something to live on. The young man immediately realized that this place served as some kind of cover for the Adventurers Guild. Our hero said out loud that the beauty was doing this in vain, but he thought to himself that he was a disgrace to the family of marquises. But the guy was interested in how the stranger recognized him, and whether the guild masters were really that skilled. Looking into the waitress's eyes and noticing her sly smile, the young man guessed how it happened. Some time ago, a view of a fortress opened up before the guy, behind which there was a village. The boy shared his joy with the horse he had been riding for a long time, because there was no one else there. Having come closer, the knight stopped him, asking why the little boy had come and why he was alone. The next minute, Jack simply showed the coat of arms of the Marquis family. With horror in his eyes and voice, the man screamed that this was the Ballantyre coat of arms. And so the knight bowed and apologized for not recognizing the young master. The guards quickly let the teenager through, wishing him a good trip. Then the guy reminded that it is dangerous to believe unverified information. The beauty began to laugh, wondering if the young man was really worried about her. The teenager noticed that for now he really treats him well, and so far the beauty hasn't done anything bad. The young man noticed that her attitude, despite the rumors, was better than that of her own brother and the accompanying knights. The waitress thanked the guy for his sincerity and kindness, because she really appreciates it. Afterwards, the blonde extended her hand because she had forgotten to introduce herself earlier. The beauty said that her name was Jane Arbeloa, master of the Arabese Guild in Arbeloa. The next moment the new acquaintances shook hands. Looking at his interlocutor, Jack thought that the blonde had a similar last name. The boy asked what kind of child she was in the family, learning that she was the third and that her brother was the local lord. He was surprised that an aristocrat was doing something that someone else should actually be doing. And so he asked whether the girl should have been married off, since she was from a noble family. Jane explained that she would not mind getting married, but her parents would never sell her to anyone like some kind of thing. Jack was offended that his family was not like that, in which everyone only thought about themselves. But his sad thoughts were dispelled by his interlocutor, who called Arnold's dog to her. The dog licked his owner, and she laughed even harder and was happy with her furry friend. Suddenly, Jane asked what the Marquis's son was doing in their village, and where his guards were. The young man emphasized that the family's shame does not need security guards. Holding the dog in her arms, the beauty looked at her new acquaintance in amazement. The girl said in surprise that the young man was not at all like many people say about him. Afterwards, Jack said that he was looking for an escort because he wouldn't be able to reach his destination on his own. Jane looked thoughtfully at our hero, saying something out loud about an escort. The protagonist emphasized that 5 people with experience in cooking and setting up the camp were needed. As payment, the guy promised 2 gold pieces in advance and 3 upon arrival, which made Jane very happy. Usually they pay 30 shillings a head, but here it was much more. But the guy didn't care much. The waitress asked if the young man would pay separately for food and lodging, adding that everything would be ready by morning. Our hero understood the blonde's hint, and so he sat down and took out his bag of money. The guy handed over 3 gold coins and said that if there was a carriage with a horse, then that would be great. Jane was glad to have such a generous guest, because usually things are not like this at all. The beauty handed the teenager the key and told him not to worry, because all the people here were very experienced. Jack thought that if the guildmaster was so experienced, there was no need to worry about the safety of the village. On the second floor there were guest rooms, and the guy went into one of them. The young man walked to the bed, where he immediately fell down, exhausted. The young man thought that the day had been as eventful as possible. Jack was almost asleep, thinking that as soon as he washed up he would go to bed, but fatigue overcame his plans. Not even a few seconds had passed, and the teenager was already fast asleep. The guy had a dream where he was crying and couldn't stop. Looking at the moon, the boy heard someone calling him an unfortunate child. The next moment, someone's hand extended chains to the young man. A female voice asked if Jack wanted to live his life in despair. The young man shook his head to show that he didn't want to, and continued to cry from despair and uncertainty. The woman explained that being good is not bad at all, because this trait is very good. But weakness is a sin, and she asked if he wanted to change and become better and stronger. For some time, the girl looked at our hero but remained silent. Suddenly, the young man declared that he wanted a change because he was tired of being unnecessary. And just a moment later, the boy's hands touched as a sign that they understood each other. The woman hugged the boy and said that now he should call her mentor. After this, the guy woke up in horror. He dreamed of her again, reminding him of those times. Jack jumped up, tears streaming down his cheeks. The memories haunting him, not leaving him even now. The young man began to listen to the noise coming from the street. And having calmed down a little, I realized that morning had finally come. The door suddenly opened and Jane loudly wished them a good morning, announcing that everything was ready. While our hero was irritably shouting that he could have knocked, a huge dog's muzzle appeared in the door. The dog suddenly rushed into the room, showing that he was glad to see Jack and began to lick the boy's cheek, which irritated him a little. After a while, Jack went down to the first floor, yawning and thinking that he would still be sleeping. Jane said with a smile that it must have been a deep sleep. Looking at the happy guy, the beauty added that she had prepared an excellent carriage for the guest. The girl also found people with extensive experience in escorting who could help with organizing the trip and protection. There were two men who had been talking nonsense about the young man yesterday, and so they greeted each other awkwardly. A strong man extended his hand, saying that his name was John Doe and that he was the captain of the fire ant squad. The teenager looked closely at the strangers, but was in no hurry to say anything. Our hero was greatly confused by the name of the man standing opposite him. The thing is that this name is given to unidentified corpses. Shaking hands with the strong man, the guy decided to now say a compliment out loud about the interesting nickname. Suddenly, John began to explain how many stops there would be and where they would spend the night. Jack listened as the guys took care of everything, even taking a good cook with them. The man answered again with a smile that nothing needed to be done. Handing over the suitcase to his assistants, the teenager said that it was time for them to go because he was already tired. A minute later, the assembled men silently walked out of the tavern one after another. Jack turned to Jane and asked the girl if the guys were seasoned. The beauty, in turn, confirmed that they are very experienced. Although the young man's body was weak, his senses and eyes remained as sharp as before. Ron had the 9th circle of magic, and even when he hid his power, he could hardly be called an ordinary person. But the mercenary was an 8th circle, and Jack thought that maybe this was not his full potential. The beauty noted that the guy asked for the best of the best, and he got them. At parting, the Marcus's 3rd son said that they would meet again. Hearing this, Jane invited her new acquaintance to have a glass of beer. Winking at the blonde, the young man declared that he was not against it, but only at the expense of the beauty. The interlocutor was not against it, and so she went to the warehouse for the best beer. After Jack left, the waitress wished the little guest a good journey. Not much time passed, and the heavy carriage was already driving along the local roads. The boy lay on the cart and thought about how wonderful the weather was, feeling calm. After that, he began to use mana, realizing that he was much better today than he was yesterday. John looked at our hero attentively, but did not dare to say anything. In turn, the teenager did not understand why his escort was looking at him so strangely, as if he was planning something. The young man asked one of the mercenaries if he had heard who the young man they were accompanying was. After a short pause, the interlocutor stated that the young man was an aristocrat and that he knew nothing more. The guard continued to explain that the master said that the boy was traveling the world. Having suggested asking the man a question, the guy noticed how he responded a little nervously that he could ask anything. A moment later, our hero reached into his pocket. Jack tossed the coat of arms to his companion, leaving the man wondering why it was done and what it meant. Holding the jewel in his hands, the young man understood that the thing belonged to a family of aristocrats, and so the mercenary asked our hero to tell him in more detail everything he knew about this coat of arms. The guy started telling that somewhere far away there was the estate of the Marquis Balantier. Their home will soon be destroyed, and this coat of arms will become a symbol of their former power. For a moment, all the men surrounded Jack, seemingly not understanding what he was talking about, and the young man continued to tell that he heard that a complete loser who had ended up in prison lived there. Laughing, the teenager continued to ask the escort if he knew anything about it, hinting that he knew a lot. Our hero watched his frightened interlocutor while he collected his thoughts. Finally, everyone understood who Jack was, because it was no longer possible to explain it more simply and clearly. The young man noted that it was funny to hear rumors about how he ended up in prison for using black magic. The teenager looked at his escort with a searching gaze, urging him to smile as he quietly apologized. And then he continued to note that he knew a little about magic, because his mentor was one of the best black magicians. Jack claimed that he was not a swordsman, but it was simply impossible not to know about something like that. The next minute, the guy was silent for a moment, observing the beauty of nature. And then the young man said that he didn't need magic because he had fists. Suddenly, Jack pointed his finger at the other man, who became scared because he didn't know what they wanted from him and what to do. The guy asked the escort just stood there while his friend was saying horrible things about him and didn't object. And the young man continued his speech, noting that no one felt sorry for an ordinary teenager. John kept an eye on all this without interfering. The young man believed that the guildmaster had only told the captain about him, but kept it a secret from the others. The next moment, our hero lightly hit his interlocutor on the shoulder. Jack reassured the man by saying that it was all in the past, and now they needed to remember that they still had a few days to be together. Trembling with horror, the guide noted that he understood everything perfectly. Finally, everyone stopped at the camp and made a fire on which food was cooked. The blonde said that rumors are just rumors, and in reality the young man is completely different. Jack was surprised that he was not considered a typical aristocrat. The young man did not hesitate and even washed his own dishes as expected. Holding the mug in his hands, the young man wanted to answer something, but he could not find the words because he was shocked by what was said. The boy, enjoying the taste of Yorkshire pudding, pie, and sausages, wanted to invite the chefs to his kitchen so that he could enjoy this every day. The guy understood that this was not just delicious, it was something amazing and delightful. Suddenly, our hero remembered Ron's food and mentally apologized, because it was even more appetizing than what he cooks. Jack said kindly that a good dinner had to be paid for because he was usually not easy to please. After the question about the guard, the teenager was offered a draw, but the boy said irritably that he needed to sleep to grow. Jack asked if the mercenary would take responsibility for his growth, to which he replied that it was not necessary. The young gentleman suggested telling stories to avoid boredom and volunteered to do so first. The young man asked how many dragons there were in the world and whether men had ever thought about this. The interlocutors recalled that the emperor had destroyed them all many centuries ago. But Jack wasn't going to finish because he hadn't even started yet, and so he began his story. Everyone listened attentively to the young owner, who explained that the myths tell how Emperor Julius Tesla killed all the dragons. Over time, the empire became smaller and smaller and could not be compared with the Tulkun Empire, located nearby. Smiling, the young man noted that this is the truth that everyone knows. Jack listed that there were 2 dragons in the Black Sea, a small one in the Teslin Castle, and 5 in the Forest of Monsters. 8 polymorphs, and a total of 16 dragons that are still alive. The young man realized that it was difficult to believe because no one had seen these creatures in reality. Jack asked with a smile if the story was interesting. He wanted to somehow develop the necessary atmosphere. And a minute later he added that dragons do not approach people. They are bound by an oath because of which they cannot approach places that threaten their lives. John asked if it was true that the emperor had not killed all the dragons that once lived in these lands. The guy said that not everyone, because the aristocrat found a way to negotiate with them. For a moment our hero was silent, but only to give his listeners a chance to think about everything he had said. The commander was interested in what the dragons were doing now. The young man explained that their continent is not the only one in the world. In addition to the western one, there is also an eastern one beyond the Black Sea. Ordinary dragons don't have much to do, but lords have only one mission, to protect the borders of the Black Sea. The young man explained that the borders were created many years ago and separate the continents, and all lords must protect them. The guy added that he himself is interested in what the world of dragons on the eastern continent looks like. For a moment, there was an awkward silence, as if the listeners had not understood anything. After a moment, one of the young men began to smile. And then everyone burst out laughing. Although the guy didn't understand why the crowd had such a reaction, he didn't say anything that could make people laugh. Afterwards, the blonde put his hand on the gentleman's shoulders and noted that he told stories beautifully and that they always needed such a companion. Jack smiled but said nothing. It seemed like the teenager didn't know how to react to this. John also began to smile, but he too did not dare to be the first to break the silence. The young man stood up and said that they could not believe him, since there was no point in proving anything. The boy went into the carriage, and when asked if he was going to sleep, he said he would wash himself and change his clothes. The man wanted to go with him because, as a guard, he should protect the boy, but the young gentleman refused because he could wash himself. Not much time passed, and the guy already approached the river and even stuck one finger in to check if the water was cold. Having undressed, the young man climbed into the river and felt relaxed. The young man understood that his story was not taken seriously, but was it worth it to behave so badly? Jack couldn't understand why he allowed himself to be laughed at as the main character, forced to hide his true powers. Leaning against a large rock, Jack noticed that the water was very refreshing, and that was what he had missed. But now the teenager is interested in only one question, although the guy did not intend to think about it so quickly. The young man remembered all the guys he had managed to meet that morning. And everything would be fine, but John Doe could be a spy for the Tulkun Empire. The young man thought that he was very suspicious, and his behavior raised even more questions. This whole situation was like a big puzzle that was very difficult to put together. The guy was surprised that he only asked for mercenaries, but among them was an 8th Circle mage. This is a lot. The captain of the metal squad had that much. Such a person would have been taken away immediately, but this man is simply the captain of some incomprehensible and unknown detachment. Having dived deeper into the water, the teenager became curious as to why no one had heard of the outstanding magician. Closing his eyes, the boy told himself that he had more important things to do than this man. The young man noted that he had almost recovered thanks to rest and the elixir. For some time, our hero looked carefully at his hands, and then decided that it was time to get out of the river. Jack knew there shouldn't be any problems, but he still needed to get to his mentor. If this escort turns out to be a spy of Tulkun, then it is better not to take him with you further. Jack thought it would be better to ask directly. The young man had already come to the company, with a sword in his hands. The men asked why he was so quick. He explained that he had to rush because an urgent matter had come up, surprising everyone. Looking at someone, our hero asked the guard if he had any idea about anything. The guy pointed his sword at John and calmly said that he was the reason for his worries. The young man asked how a person with the 8th circle of magic could work as a simple mercenary. The interlocutor heard Jack say that he was going to a very important place. It is so dear to him that he is not going to bring there a person who is carefully hiding something. Another man asked in surprise if it was true that his colleague had an 8th circle and how that was possible. He confirmed that he really had that much power. But there was nothing wrong with that. The young man said that he had told him an interesting story, but now he wanted to hear John's story, to which he did not react in any way. The interlocutor asked if he was against saying who he was and why he was accompanying the guy. Our hero, smiling, said that the man would die by the sword. Suddenly, Jack turned his gaze towards the young man, asking if it was perhaps him, and after a short pause, he added that perhaps the guy was a spy for the Tulkun Empire. A minute later, the young man remembered Jane, who had said that the next time they met, they would have a drink, hinting that she might be involved. The man shouted, noting what the young girl had to do with it. The young man asked the man if he was interested in whether Jack would treat her before killing her. Afterwards, he continued to note with a smile that the situation had become much more interesting, driving the mercenary crazy. The captain simply hissed in displeasure, despite the fact that the young man had gone this far. But he did not use magic. Jack gave him 2 options, either die or let him live, because he had poor self-control. Our hero smiled as he said that he was giving his opponent a few minutes to think. The day before, in the pub, Jane had been talking to John, and they had discussed the young landlord, noting that his eyes showed that he was hiding a lot. The girl explained that the family almost abandoned this young man, although he is not at all like many people say about him. The blonde tried to convince her interlocutor that the young man was an ordinary teenager. The beauty explained that the guy needed an escort, and it was better for the man to know what was what. Jane took John's hand, saying that this whole story could possibly change their lives. The captain understood that looking into those eyes, it was unlikely that one could find out whether the guy was hated by his own family. The man looked at the young man and thought about what to do. He had a very difficult choice in front of him that needed to be made very quickly. The young gentleman politely asked whether his interlocutor had thought about it, or whether a minute was too short. Jack thought to himself that he was like a deer who had met a lion, all his senses screaming about danger. There was a tense atmosphere in the air. Everyone just looked at the young man, standing behind the commander. The man himself did not understand how the guy knew that he had the 8th circle. Looking at the young man, John thought that Jane might have told him the truth, although this was very unlikely. For a moment there was silence. No one knew what to say. The man believed the girl, who would never do anything like that. This would only be possible if the guy was asking for something. Looking at the blade of the sword, the teenager reminded himself that he only had 40 seconds left to think. The captain said that the young man himself recognized his great power, so how could the guy kill him? The young man began to think to himself about what the enemy had just said about the murder. John wondered what was in the guy's eyes, so much desire for blood. And at that moment he doubted something, namely whether the boy standing in front of him is really a child. The comrades behind wanted to know the truth, so it was even more difficult to know what to say. The man understood that he had lived his entire life as a mercenary, and now all the actions he had committed flashed before his eyes. Closing his eyes, the captain thought that he was quite lucky. Jack noted that time was up, which made John even more nervous, as he didn't know whether to tell the truth. The young gentleman threatened that if he was not ready, he would have to say goodbye to life. Suddenly, the man looking at our hero emphasized that he could tell us something, asking if the guy could tell what was going on with Jane. The very next moment, the guy lowered his sword and began to speak. John's story is short, although it is a love story between an aristocrat and a commoner. When he was 17 years old, he had the 7th circle of magic. Then he met her. The guys fell in love with each other at first sight. Since then, they have never been apart for a day. Now Jack understood why Jane didn't get married. It's still strange that the man continues to work as a mercenary, because with his skills, he could become Tesla's support. The man felt awkward because his friends started asking about his relationship with the lady. Although, given the blonde's character, it is safe to say that her family is not interested in increasing power through marriage. The young man asked again if Jane was really just a master of the Adventurers Guild in a small province, and John was a mercenary. Closing his eyes, the interlocutor noted that this was indeed the case. Jack found it hard to believe, because such a story is not difficult to make up. The young man asked if those gathered remembered the story about the dragons and also what the Tulkun Empire would do with the dragon. To this, the man simply quickly replied that how could he know about mythical creatures? The boy smiled, looking straight into the eyes of his interlocutor, but continued to remain silent. Suddenly, the young man began to tell what those who carry 10 circles of magic in their hearts are called, but even the masters do not know that there is something more in this world. Continuing, that monsters that use not lies but the soul as power are called transcendence. John's comrades were very surprised by what they heard. Our hero, raising his hand, decided to remain silent for a moment to allow everyone gathered to think about what had been said. And the guy continued to say that in 2 years, the captain of the Knights of the Tulkun Empire, Heinkus Beggarman, will become a master and will be called the strongest knight of the continent. He will help forgotten stories about transcendence become reality. But the funny thing is that he himself cannot become one. John politely asked to continue telling the story because he was very interested in it. Heinkus will replace half of his blood and bones with dragons, and obsessed with this, will become half human, half dragon. Looking at the faces of his companions, Jack emphasized that it was immediately clear that the story was not so funny. The listeners stood rooted to the spot, looking at our hero with horror in their eyes. John was only interested in how it all connected to what was happening here and now. The guy explained that there was only one dragon in the Empire so far, and you couldn't conduct many experiments with it. And then the Empire sends people to other countries to collect information and dragons. The man laughed, because this story all sounded like a story for a novel. And so the interlocutor suggested telling this tale to others in order to amuse them too. Our hero thought to himself that this man was unlikely to be a spy, but the rumor stated that all doubts were dispelled. Jack began to move away and wished happiness with the guildmaster, adding that an invitation to their wedding awaited him. Suddenly, panic began to appear in the teenager's eyes. The young man quickly took out his sword and pointed it at the man who was about to leave. The man stood completely calmly with his back turned, unable to do anything. For a while, our hero stood silently because he did not know what he could say or do. Time seemed to drag on forever for both the boy and his opponent. Suddenly, Jack aggressively announced that, since he was the first to suspect the man, he would spare his life. Taking the man by the collar of his coat, he added that this was the last warning. And he added that if he goes against him, our hero will turn everyone present into dust. The listeners turned to the owner and the captain and asked them to lower their weapons and talk calmly. It seemed to Jack that because they had become closer, he had pushed the boys away from himself with this action. Everyone dispersed. The young gentleman went to the carriage and was already going to bed, trying to make himself as comfortable as possible. Around the campfire, a conversation began about why John should be a mercenary if he has the 8th circle of magic. One of the guys said that a couple of years ago a colleague had the 4th circle, which he personally confirmed. And again there was an awkward silence. The interlocutor began to think about something. One of his colleagues thought to himself that the captain was good and even saved his life, so he was not going to be offended by him. Afterwards, the blonde declared that their leader was the best mercenary captain on the entire continent and offered to become the king of mercenaries. John thought it was a very stupid title, and he knew there were 4 masters among the mercenaries. As he sat down, the man stated that this was not the best idea. The blue-eyed, golden-haired youth decided to ask again whether the young master's words were true. The leader, tired of making excuses, answered honestly that the young master had not deceived anyone. The young man said it was shocking news, but he would get over it. However, the comrade was interested in why John did nothing when Jack came at him with a sword. The man did not answer immediately. It seemed that he was collecting his thoughts. Even now, the captain's hands were shaking, although enough time had passed since the incident to calm down. It seemed to him that he was on the verge of death. Despite his strength, a little more, and he could die of fear. Looking at the calm surface of the water, the commander thought that this little fellow was interesting, although dangerous. There is a fight for the throne now, and if spies and dragons appear, it will only get worse. Therefore, the leader wants to learn more from the young man. A couple of days later, the guys were driving to their destination again, and Jack suggested telling a story again. The men asked with displeasure what it was this time, thinking that they would have to hear something absurd again. But the young man began to talk about an orc lord living in a magical forest. Those gathered thought that this ruler was in the 9th circle, but it turned out that he was already in the 10th. The guy said that someday they would know for sure and would not guess, but now he wanted to tell a story about the past. The man asked again about what past, because it could be 100 years ago, or 5. The young man explained that if we take imperial time, then it was 23 years ago. Jack explained that the man loved weapons, and asked if they knew about his relationship with Lady Harpy. The men responded indifferently that they didn't know, and the young man explained that it is generally accepted that their relationship is not very good. Although he was upset to himself, realizing that the mercenaries who constantly hang around in the forest for money do not know even the smallest thing. These two races are considered the strongest in the forest, and are even called its protectors, as they protect it with their powers. It was strange to hear that the Orc Lord and the Harpies had such a relationship, since at first they were only neighbors. And to make the story sound more interesting, our hero looked at nature and fell silent for a while. At that time, Blackman became a lord and began to increase his power to become an authority for everyone else. But the problems began 5 years ago, and listeners did not understand what could be the cause of these difficulties. And again the teenager smiled, hoping that his listeners would throw in some ideas. Although Jack later explained that when they found out about Harpy and Blackman's relationship, everything didn't go according to plan. People, Harpies, and Orcs all strove for one thing. Despite their differences, they all needed strength. Our hero smiled, noting that this is exactly what everyone wants. Some wanted to overthrow the ruler, and this operation was supposed to be secret, but everything went wrong, and they are still in power. John asked why relations between the races had not improved yet, when it could easily have been done. Jack explained that after the internal uprisings, Blackman and Valea decided that their people were more important than any kind of love. And again everyone fell silent, thinking about what to say. The captain did not understand whether he should believe the young man, although he said out loud that he was interested. But he knew that 10 years ago, these races were not so dangerous. It all started quite recently, when they began to actively increase their forces. The Harpies taught the Orcs their secret fighting techniques, and they in turn adopted elementalism from them. Jack concluded that these powerful creatures that inhabited the forest were able to learn a lot from each other. Raising his finger, our hero declared that Blackman and Vileja had directly contributed to this. But after that they left and became the main inhabitants of the magical forest. Realizing that the interlocutors had become too serious, the teenager stepped on the captain's foot. And then he said that if the mercenaries ever get there, they can tell this story, and perhaps they won't be killed. The surprised interlocutor did not know how to react to this. John did not understand whether this was true or not, since the young man was not an ordinary person. But he decided to pretend that he believed it and promised that he would definitely do it. Suddenly, the man remembered that Jane had cooked the meat and offered the young master to try the dish, which he happily agreed to. Our hero really liked the taste, and the man noted that it was the girl who prepared this dish. Meanwhile, rumors reached the Marquis that the bodyguards accompanying his third son had been found dead near the province. The servant said that the guards were killed by people with a high level of magic. The Marquis sat in silence for a while, wondering how this could have happened. The man decided that this happened when the Metal Blood Squad was not there. In his mind, he suspected that it could have been the Emperor or the Duke, but he was not sure who else could have done such a thing. The aristocrat understood that it was necessary to conduct a personal investigation, and turning to Gonzalez, he stated that the culprit should be found. The servant listened attentively to what was said to him, noting that he would do everything as needed. The Marquis then asked why the young man had not mentioned his younger son, whether he had not been there, and whether he had survived. The reporter said he was not among the bodies, and most likely simply ran to safety. The head of the family ordered to find him, because he might know something important to clarify the situation. and once again the Marquis ordered his subordinate to find out everything as quickly as possible. Looking after the young man, the man remained silent, thinking about something. As Gonzalez was leaving, he heard the Marquis say that he thought his son was stupid, but it turned out that he was different. It was just unclear whether this news upset or pleased the aristocrat. The servant turned around for a moment, but decided that it was none of his business. Finally, the travelers reached the mountain range. Jack handed over a bag containing a pile of gold coins, saying that it was payment for the work. The very next moment, John began to open the knapsack. Looking inside in horror, everyone gathered could not believe that they now had so much money. However, our hero said that everything was fine. He had 10 elixirs left, and that was all he needed. The young man said that everything else was tips for good work and delicious food, because besides that, it was a lot of fun traveling with the guys. Looking at his serious interlocutor, the teenager asked for forgiveness for suspecting the man. The guy said goodbye and emphasized that the guys should be careful on the way home. But instead of leaving, the interlocutor did not move from his place, which caused a number of questions from the young man. Suddenly, John spoke up, saying that he might be crossing the line, but he wanted to say something. Our hero looked at the captain with wide eyes, not understanding what he wanted to say. The man began to say that the work of a mercenary is not as bad as it seems. Jack didn't understand what this information meant, but decided not to interrupt. And the captain continued to say that he didn't know everything, and therefore he would say what he was sure of. John saw people like the third son, rejected by everyone who were in the same position. The sad eyes of our hero showed that he had been touched to the very heart. Smiling, the guy began to ask if the commander was hinting that he should also become a mercenary. John said again that it wasn't such a bad thing. If you don't take on dangerous tasks, you can see the whole world and earn good money. The man assured the boy that he could have such an experience, trying to cheer him up. Jack began to say that everyone might not understand, but the interlocutor already definitely knows everything. If our hero wanted to, he could kill the man with ease. The young man knew he was not an 8th circle mage, but even he understood what the commander must have felt. The captain knew this, which is why he told the guy that he didn't yet realize the extent of his power. Scratching his head, the man said he was no longer worried about it. In a world where everything is decided by someone's sword, many hide their true strength and intentions. The young man thanked him for the wonderful words, but pretended that he had not heard anything. And then he whispered into his interlocutor's ear that in a few years, trouble would come to the continent. The best solution would be to hide and do nothing. Jack knew that John would not understand these words, but asked him to remember them. The teenager emphasized that this would be a serious situation, and it was not worth selling out for a few gold pieces, because life was more important than money. The interlocutor smiled sincerely, and said that he would definitely do everything as he was advised. Our hero noted that the man is a good person, and then the guy smiled tenderly and said that they guys could be free. The young man began to walk into the forest, confidently planning his actions that would help him achieve his goal. But the guy's attention was suddenly drawn to the captain, who asked him to wait. Afterwards, the man asked what the young man's name was. Jack didn't understand why this was necessary if the captain already knew. However, the next moment our hero's mood improved, and so the guy introduced himself as Jack. The teenager didn't want to be rude or impolite, so he asked a counter-question about the captain's name. For several minutes, the leader stood silently, seeming to be pondering his answer. However, the man then sheepishly replied that his name was Dinas, or more precisely, Dinastimo. The young man noted with joy in his voice that he understood everything. Finally, Jack suggested that they meet again sometime, because now John was a comrade to him. Not much time passed, and our hero was already running through the forest. With the speed of light, the young man jumped to a great height, thanks to magic. Jack knew he had to hurry because it would soon be dark. The next minute, the young man stopped and looked around. The guy realized that he was already very close, because he remembered the area and quickly moved along the mountain. Standing in the middle of huge boulders, our hero peered into the distance. Stepping onto the grass, the young man noted to himself that his body was still too small. This means that Jack cannot jump as far as he would like. Standing in front of some wall, the young man thought about something. Finally, the guy realized that he had found the entrance to a cave where it was very dark and even a little scary. Once inside, our hero lit his way so as not to get hurt in the dark and to find his way. After a while, Jack reached a familiar cracked wall and was sure that what he was looking for was here. There was his mentor, the one he had been looking for so long. The teenager leaned his head against the wall and remembered what had tormented him so much in the past. It was impossible to do without magic in this place, and so the young man opened one of his potions. The young man began to spray the elixir on the wall, realizing that something important was about to happen. Taking out his sword, the guy thought that he had one very important thing left. Our hero put the blade on his hand. It was unclear what the teenager was going to do. The very next moment, Jack cut his hand, from which blood began to flow. Last time, Jack just hid and ran away. After Ron was killed, he had no choice but to die. Unable to do this, the young man threw down his dagger. The young man began to cry from hopelessness and his own weakness. This caused blood and tears to start mixing. Our hero understood what was happening, but it seemed he was not going to do anything else. Suddenly, the young man looked with surprise at the wall, which began to open, and he saw a passage. At that time, for the guy it was a great stroke of luck, something he had never even dreamed of. The young man could not imagine that such a thing was even possible. This time, the passage also opened, but it was no longer surprising because now everything is different. Our hero went further, continuing to light the way in the large cave, which was increasingly reminiscent of the past. Descending the vintage staircase, the teenager was silent. He didn't want to think either. Wrapping his hand, the young man did not understand why he was so worried. Perhaps the reason was that decades had passed since then. Not much time passed, and the guy already found himself in some room. Each new step was more difficult and slower than the previous one. At some point, our hero put his suitcase on the floor and sat down on one knee. Jack saw the mentor he had missed so much, but she was a little different than the last time they had seen each other. The girl looked at the guy in amazement, because she didn't understand at all who it was. The teenager suddenly thought that everyone in this world wants to live as long as possible, including orcs, dragons, emperors. This is natural, although perhaps not entirely wrong. The same applies to the one who saved him in his past life. The teacher lived for more than 400 years. This was made possible by the separation of soul and body, and magic maintained the connection between them. The problem is that this process will soon come to an end. In her past life, after meeting Jack, she lived only 10 years. But this time everything will be different. In this life, you will be given 13 whole years. The young man looked at the girl without taking his eyes off her, thinking about how long he had wanted to hear her voice. And the teacher asked who this young man was whom she was seeing for the first time. The young man asked her a counter question, asking if she wanted to guess it herself. The girl didn't like this attitude, and so the beauty asked why the teenager was making fun of her. And without waiting for an answer, she declared that she would not ask twice, and therefore our hero must give a clear answer. The guy addressed his interlocutor with affection, saying that his dear mentor used to be so picky. And a moment later, he continued to note that he missed her very much. Afterwards, the girl noted that she didn't even know who he was, and asked if the guy knew who she was. Jack, leaning on one knee, replied that of course he knew, since he had often mentioned her both in the past and in this life. Our hero thought to himself how he could not know about the witch. He remembered all the moments they spent together, because it was not an illusion at all, but only for him. Clenching his fist, the teenager thought sadly about how bad it was that his interlocutor didn't know this. Jack said that the girl is the heroine of this world, who brought the end of honor and laid the foundation for humanity. The young man claimed that she was Valentine Milos. The young man did not know what kind of reaction to expect, and so he hesitated a little and only then continued to say that he was her student from the future. The witch looked at her interlocutor with distrust, not understanding what he was talking about. The teacher angrily pointed out that the boy didn't know that she didn't like predictions. After this, the young man emphasized that he knew and quoted her words from the past. The girl wondered why Jack was talking like that then. The witch said if she really was in this future, what would her answer be? The guy said with confidence that she would have ordered him to disappear immediately, and she in turn ironically noted that our hero should open a fortune-telling tent. Hearing the girl say that she was nobody to the boy, he thought that it had been like that before too. Our hero thought to himself that the witch had not changed at all from her previous life, but he said out loud that nothing could be done. Drawing his sword, Jack apologized for having to go so far, realizing he had no choice. The teenager's eyes showed anger and some surprise, but he was in no hurry to do anything. The boy held the sword tightly and seemed to know exactly what he was going to do. With sadness in her voice, the witch began to say something to our hero. The mentor stated that the teenager was using aura, which she did not like because the consequences could be dangerous. The young man confirmed that he knew how badly he was behaving and was ready for any punishment she chose. Gripping the sword tighter in his hand, the young man continued to remark that it was best to leave this for later. The witch looked closely at her student, beginning to understand what awaited them. Beauty knew that if Jack broke the chains, the whole place would disappear and collapse, but it could not be avoided. With fury in his voice, the teenager noted that this was his main goal, to break and destroy everything. The guy stated that there was no other choice anyway. Despite this, Jack was confident that he could free the girl, so he decided to act without delay. The teacher looked at the young man with horror but could not and did not want to do anything, remembering the unpleasant story of her life. Julius Teslin locked the girl here, promising that he would return for her. However, his promise remained unfulfilled. The traitor never came. At first, the witch's soul still held a glimmer of hope that everything would be fine. Years later, the girl realized that she had been abandoned forever, and the mentor could only come to terms with it. Jack swung his sword with a cry, gathering all his strength into the blow, his tenacity helping him overcome any difficulties. Our hero understood that he would fight until he achieved his goal and freed the girl. At some point, the situation began to change, which gave the guy even more strength. Finally, the shackles cracked. Valentine was surprised because they were made of dragon bones, and therefore it seemed impossible. For some time, the witch could not believe her luck. And then suddenly the girl began to fall, not understanding what would await her next. The teenager knew that he was his mentor's only hope, and therefore there was not a minute to lose. A moment later, Jack easily picked up the girl. Looking sincerely at the witch, the boy said that he was not like Julius Teslin. And then he added that he would prove it with all his actions. Valentine looked at him with disbelief, not believing that after everything, someone was actually saving her. Despite all the sentimentality, our hero had no time for this, because the young man heard the noise of stones. The walls started to crumble. Jack firmly told them to hold on tighter to avoid any possible dangers. The young man was scared, but he tried not to show it, because he knew that there was no turning back. Our hero saw the boulder fly down, and horror briefly froze in the guy's eyes. Suddenly, the youth cast a spell, raised his sword and gathered all his power into it, preparing to use the basic technique. A powerful energy began to thicken around the girl and the young man. It was one of the 4 defensive techniques. The teacher knew that it was called the Mountain of the 4 Elements, and she had to repel the blow. Having plunged the sword into the stone floor, the boys saw how they were enveloped in a cloud of mana, which gradually began to expand around them. For a moment, it seemed to our hero that this energy pierced even the hair on his head. The guy held on with all his might, clutching his mentor as tightly as he could. A moment later, there was an explosion. The light spread over hundreds of meters, scattering stones around. Jack and Valentine remained unharmed. The girl asked who the young man was, possessing such great power. For a while, our hero was silent. It seemed that he had no time for questions after what he had just experienced. And then he replied that he said he was an ordinary student from the future. Having put the mentor on the ground, the guy heard a question about where he got such powers from, and the guy answered that this is not the limit. With a smile, the guy said that they would spend the next 30 years together, exploring the world and training. The very next moment, the mentor began to stretch out her small hands towards our hero. The girl took him by the cheeks and looked into his eyes, checking whether the guy was telling the truth or lying. The young man wasn't sure if this technique worked, but it didn't matter. The teacher asked again if it was true that the guy was from the future, which surprised Jack. The guy clarified that he most likely returned to the past. Finally, our hero began to laugh, noting that he was glad that the witch listened to him and believed what he told him. The young man suddenly fell down, exhausted, having spent all his strength on the spell that helped them both stay whole. The girl said it was strange to start their relationship when the guy had such power. But our hero explained that otherwise the mentor would not have believed him. With surprise, the witch noted that, despite the pain, the teenager could still argue. Still smiling, the guy said that it couldn't be otherwise, because he took all his habits from Valentine. Turning his head slightly, the young man decided it was time to introduce himself, and so he gave his name. And after a little hesitation, he said that he hoped that in this life he and his mentor would also do a lot of good. 5 days later, the boys found themselves in the province of Osenbla. Closing his eyes, the teenager began to ask his companion something. Looking at her student with an impassive gaze, the girl remained completely silent, and Jack continued to ask his mentor about their long silence. The young man couldn't understand how it was possible to say nothing for 5 days. So I decided to joke and asked if perhaps the girl had started paying for the words she said at some point. Valentine replied that she didn't think the guy belonged to the Tesla Empire, but most of all, the witch was surprised by his ability to control the magic of souls. And then the beauty said something else about gaining power and strength. After these words, the witch fell silent, hoping that Jack would continue her thought. The guy knew that if he didn't explain the situation, she would hit him, just like she did in her past life. The young man said that there are powers that only a few possess, but she was not surprised. Valentine noted that his soul was shrouded in thousands of deaths and patiently waited for an answer. The young man said that he would like to tell what happened in his past life, but the girl did not speak to him for 5 days. And again the witch explained that the teenager had more blood on his hands than she did. Suddenly Valentine asked if the young man had thought about what had happened. And a minute later she added why the chance for a second life was given to the young man. Jack himself didn't understand why this happened to him, but he still couldn't find an answer. The next moment our hero remembered the battle, as well as the unknown horseman. Although after just a minute the guy returned to real time. The young man said that he had thought about everything but had not come up with anything interesting. Jack asked the girl not to look as if he had brought himself back, believing that it was done by someone who was pursuing some goal of their own. The young man shared his food with the dog and said that if this was true, the unknown person would appear, but if not, he would continue to live his life. The girl looked closely at her interlocutor but said nothing, and Jack emphasized that time spent with her is most important. The mentor noticed that the guy was good at speaking, but she still didn't understand what their plan was, and Jack said that they needed to look for allies. Looking closely at the dog, the guy noted that without the right people, he would not be able to do anything. The very next moment, our hero began to remember the events of the past days. In those days, the young man took the mentor with him, and at that point, he interrupted his thought. And then he remembered again that at that time, the young man almost died. I had to drink 2 high-grade elixirs to ease the pain, but the effects were still felt. Suddenly, our hero suggested to his companion that they go shopping and see the town. Jack stated that he needed a new sword, but was interrupted by an unexpected event. The guy froze as if he saw something quite strange. Suddenly, a girl with a basket of flowers flew out from around the corner, shouting for everyone gathered to move aside. The blonde collided with Jack and fell, scattering her flowers around. Our hero began to explain, saying that he himself had not looked around, but after a moment he faltered and fell silent. While the beauty was complaining about how she had overslept everything, the young man was thinking about how he could start with a stranger. Realizing that he needed to be polite, the guy asked the blonde how she was feeling, and just a moment later the young man approached the blonde with a proposal to work together, which surprised the girl, who at first did not know what to answer him. Looking at the bag of coins, and also hearing the guy say that this was payment for the work, the beauty began to scream. Looking inside, the stranger was taken aback for a moment, and then began to say something unintelligible again. The beauty refused the bag of money, believing that it was too much for a simple peasant woman, but Jack insisted on his help. The boy asked how much she needed, and the girl replied that 1 shilling would be quite enough for her needs. Less than a minute later, our hero handed over the required amount to his new acquaintance. Picking up the basket of flowers, the blonde declared that from now on it all belonged to the teenager. The young man wanted to say something else, but the stranger quickly said goodbye and ran away. Jack realized that this could be the beginning of their cooperation in the future, noting to himself that he had not seen vampires for a long time. The mentor emphasized that she did not expect to meet a vampire in such a place, with which Jack agreed. A second later, the guy turned to the witch, asking again if the blonde was really a vampire, not expecting it at all, while his partner thought that he chose her because of this. Jack explained that he took the stranger because he believed that she could reach the 10th level of the circle, and there was no other reason for it. The mentor emphasized that the guy's stupidity was surprising. He would have to learn a lot, but on the contrary, he was happy and wanted her to live long. The young man noted with joy that the witch had not changed at all, and the girl thought about the familiar face of the vampire, feeling as if she had seen her before, but she couldn't remember where exactly. Suddenly, the teacher remembered that she had once walked in a beautiful grove. There were young people there having fun together, and it confused her. The teacher remembered that she was a blonde beauty. Only the witch did not think that the inhabitants of the demonic forest could appear here, because they usually do not leave their possessions. And then, changing the subject, she noted that she knew where to buy a sword. Vampires, like dragons, are a very special race. Their relations with other peoples have always been complex and confusing. While the young man was choosing a sword, he was simultaneously thinking about the war that had taken place several years ago between these creatures. The reason was power over the demonic forest. And in this confrontation, the dragons won, forcing the vampires to flee their lands. Surely that girl also escaped from there, or she is the child of those who managed to do so. For a moment, the guy returned to reality, looking carefully at the table on which the cats were sleeping. The young man thought that this was much more pleasant than the wars that he would like to forget forever. The seller described the sword so that the guy would finally buy one, but it pissed him off and he wanted to get out of there as soon as possible. Our hero has finally chosen the right weapon for himself. Jack turned to his mentor and said that he had already decided who would be his first comrade. Once outside, Valentine asked her student again if he was sure of his choice. The young man understood her doubts. but he thought that this could be useful not only to him. After all, a young lady can reveal her potential and become very strong. It seemed that the mentor either did not fully understand or did not believe the young man. And so I asked again whether the guy was doing all this, not just for his own plan. Our hero should know that the mentor asked for a reason. The fact is that 400 years ago, she herself made a contract with people who had the blood of dragons. Many races moved into the forest where they could not be found. The emperors who made this treaty are long dead. No matter how strong they were, time still proved stronger. Even after this, other races could not leave the forest. The reason was that the dragons forbade them to do so, and the law remained in force for a long time. These creatures watched everyone closely, understanding that the rules could not be broken. The teacher's law remained unchanged, so all the dragons had to be killed. But now our hero thought that he could save them in this life. The next minute, Valentine saw a vampire being stroked on the head by some strong man. The young man turned to his mentor but was in no hurry to say anything. Our hero placed his thumbs on the girl's little hand, and then he said that she shouldn't bother taking responsibility for their past actions. The vampire happily took the orc blood, thanking the seller. Answering his teacher's question, Jack replied that he knew a lot about her because he was her student and had studied the lessons well. The girl agreed with him and our hero just laughed. But Valentine, looking at the tomatoes, warned the student not to feed his blood. The young man looked attentively at his interlocutor, not understanding what she meant. Jack didn't know what the witch wanted to say, but he thought that the girl was still a child, and they were supposed to be fed with goodies. The young vampire went home and recalled her recent conversation with the aristocrat. She wondered what the guy should answer, because he wanted to offer her a job. Although the blonde was flattered that someone asked her to be an assistant. Holding the blood in her hands, the girl thought about generous people, meaning our hero, and decided that after this drink her parent would feel better. Her mother always told her not to drink human blood or any other blood, even in extreme cases. The woman did not explain this, but the girl remembered the instructions forever. You can only use the one that your uncle brings. Entering the house, the blonde thought that perhaps he would show up today and help her with this issue. Looking around and not seeing her mother, the girl thought that perhaps she was resting. And while the beauty began to call the woman, she emphasized that guests had come to them, but the girl did not see anyone in the house. Entering the bedroom, Charlotte asked where this man was. Suddenly, she heard Jack's voice from behind and was very surprised by his appearance here, not understanding how he was able to find their home. The blonde looked at her new acquaintance with horror, unable to utter another word. At the same time, our hero sat silently and simply smiled. Looking at the woman, Valentine thought that it would be better for her to get up rather than lie around doing nothing. Then the teacher told Charlotte's mother that they had not seen each other for a long time. The witch began to question her about the reasons for their current state. Vivienne de Royale was a vampire of noble blood, known for her power, but her current state raised doubts about her true strength. Jack and Charlotte went outside. The girl was feeding the birds, and the guy did not understand why she was wasting time on this activity. Our hero heard the teacher telling the girl's mother something about mana, hoping that nothing would happen. At the house, Vivienne began to ask her interlocutor who she was and whether she was by any chance a vampire hunter. With sadness in her eyes, the witch asked if the young woman had forgotten her face. But suddenly the blonde remembered Valentine. Meanwhile, the witch was recalling how the vampires were driven out of the forest, and this brought back sad memories. The pale interlocutor wanted to say something but could not find the right words. Before she could say anything, the vampire began to cough heavily, and the mentor continued asking questions about their current lives. But it wasn't that easy, because the woman bent over on the bed and fell silent. The witch saw that the vampire was not feeling well, and therefore decided to postpone the questions for a bit. A minute later, Vivienne learned that her friend had become so small because of a spell, and only once a month could she live like an ordinary person. But the next moment, the witch declared that it didn't matter at all. The mentor asked what the vampire elite were doing in such a backwater, because Vivienne was very strong, and now no one was afraid of her. Looking from under her brows, the witch continued to say that she saw clearly. And a minute later, she continued that the young woman had not drunk blood for a long time, not understanding why she had to go so far. The woman continued to cough, holding her fist to her heart and trying to say something. And then she asked if her mentor felt sorry for her. Looking out the window, Valentine silently began to talk about how much time had passed since those glorious times. Previously, the vampire was very strong, the kind that everyone was truly afraid of, despite her pretty appearance. Back then, no one could have imagined that the blonde would turn into a weak and feeble woman. The mentor noted that she no longer saw the same vitality that had been in her interlocutor since their last meeting. Valentine said that if it weren't for Vivienne, they would have already died at the hands of fanatics who persecuted them for their magical abilities. Lying down on the bed and throwing her hand over her forehead, the young vampire noted that she was ready to answer the question. There were 5 creatures hiding in the forest, and behind them stood 2 lords. They were the ones who controlled everything, and therefore it was the most dangerous time. For this reason, in the past, vampires had to leave the forest. This was the only way to escape oppression. At that time, Vivienne's daughter was very small and did not understand anything. She could not even walk. As the dragon dealt with everyone, the young woman sat on the ground and begged for mercy. The monster looked at its victim and thought about what decision to make. And then the dragon emphasized that he felt sorry for Vivienne, so he took pity on them. The interlocutor did not understand how this was possible, but the vampire said that it was true. Now they live among cows and pigs, but somehow they cope with it. The main thing for Vivienne is to raise her daughter. The woman was glad that her baby had everything she needed. She was happy. The witch listened to this whole story with astonished eyes and did not understand how this was possible. The mentor considered this unworthy, because Vivienne was an aristocrat, in whose veins the blood of rulers flowed. Instead, the girl drags out a miserable existence in some small town and waits for her death. Suddenly, Charlotte asked Jack when they were leaving. The girl explained that her uncle did not like guests very much and might be angry at their appearance. Our hero was very surprised by this, and therefore he wanted to know something. The young man asked if the beauty could tell more about her uncle. Charlotte was horrified by what she heard. The blonde did not understand why a stranger needed such information. However, she said that her uncle would hardly like the teenager, and Jack was outraged that she thought exactly that. The young man explained that he was bored waiting, and therefore just wanted to listen to an interesting story. The girl agreed because it was not difficult for her. The beauty thought for a moment because she did not understand where to start. Charlotte explained that she didn't know much. All that was known was that he bought this house for them and that he brought them food every 3 days. The young man thought to himself that most likely they were talking about the blood of pigs and cows. Jack began to tell the girl to listen carefully, wanting to convey important information. Suddenly, our hero was interrupted by a man who asked in surprise why they were talking about him. After that, he asked the girl about her new friend who was standing nearby. The stranger noted that he was seeing the young man for the first time. The girl was glad to see her uncle, because she did not expect such a meeting in this place. The next minute, the boys looked attentively at their interlocutor. Jack said that he was probably the uncle the young girl had talked about earlier, when she remembered her relatives in the city. The man noticed that the young man was an aristocrat, and after that, he asked what brought the guy to this house, where guests are not often received. The stranger fell silent, but he looked intently at our hero. Jack suspected that the man might be a dragon, although he tried not to show it until he had something to say. At this very time, Charlotte's mother was telling her friend that a lot of guests had come to visit them. Vivienne asked Valentine to take her daughter off the street so that she could tell her something important while the men were staring at each other. Uncle noticed once again that there were too many guests for this place. The mentor mentally asked Jack to bring the girl and the man so as not to leave anyone out of the important conversation. The young man was quietly whispering something under his breath, and the stranger selfishly asked what he was muttering. Taking hold of the door handle, our hero explained that the mentor had asked him to come. Suddenly, our hero stopped and asked if the man hadn't come for an important conversation, and after a short pause, he added that he was talking about a conversation with his toy. The very next minute, a group of people was climbing the stairs. The woman lying in bed began calling for her daughter. Vivienne, rising slightly, began to point at someone in horror. The man, smiling, began to ask what had surprised the mistress of the house so much. Had she really seen a ghost? And then he continued to say that he just came so they could just talk. And with sarcasm in his voice, he noted that he promised not to make a scandal before the death of the young woman. Charlotte started asking what was wrong with her mother. Had she gotten worse? She looked as if she had not expected such a turn of events. The girl picked up a bowl of orc blood and forced her mother to drink it to make her feel better, although her parent did not want to accept this help. The woman emphasized that she had prepared a gift for the girl's birthday, and apologized that she could not give it even now. Charlotte looked at her mother in horror, not understanding what was happening to her. Our hero listened attentively to the conversation of his relatives, but did not interfere in it. In fact, Jack and the mentor weren't supposed to see all this in the first place. They accidentally bumped into the girl and followed her out of pure interest, especially since there was no reason to keep an eye on the blonde. Realizing that there was no time to waste, the young man turned to the sick woman. Jack asked if Lady Vivienne would trust him with her daughter. The woman did not understand what was being discussed and looked at the guy with horror. And our hero added with calmness in his voice that they had little time, and therefore the guy was going to get to the point. Jack continued asking what the woman wanted for Charlotte. The guy asked if the mother wanted her daughter to become a full-fledged vampire with the whole world at her feet. And again, our hero asked if Vivienne wanted to avenge all the vampires and kill the dragon, which greatly interested his uncle. The man was surprised by the words of the young man, who was commenting on something under his breath. Realizing that hardly anyone was looking at him, the reborn dragon smiled sarcastically, clearly expecting the long-awaited denouement. Vivienne raised her hand with difficulty and extended it towards Jack. Charlotte's mother stressed that she would like a better fate for her daughter. The woman noted with calmness in her voice that she had nothing to wish for except one thing. And then she noted that she wanted the girl to always smile, and that would be enough. The woman finally asked if she could find out the young man's name after hearing how he introduced himself. Then Vivienne asked if the young man could protect her daughter in the future. Our hero was silent for a moment and then declared that he would definitely do everything. And he said that the woman who possessed noble vampire blood would rest in peace for eternity. Vivienne began to fall apart, but at the last moment she managed to hold her daughter's cheek and said that she loved her very much. The girl looked at her parent in fear, tears streaming from her eyes. Charlotte didn't want this. She hysterically asked her mother not to close her eyes because she couldn't believe what was happening. Jack decided it was time to take his mentor in his arms. A minute later, everyone gathered was looking at the empty bed. Jack held his mentor in his arms while Charlotte cried in despair, not knowing what to do next. The guy wanted to say something, but he couldn't find the words that would comfort the girl. The man sitting to the side began to laugh loudly, attracting the attention of everyone in the room with him. The dragon spoke about some truth but did not explain, but the very next moment he began to laugh as he never had before. Everyone gathered watched the man closely, not knowing what to say to him. And he said that he was going to die laughing because Jack had taken custody of a vampire who was going to die soon. A second later, Jack was already flying over his opponent, focusing his mana in his fist, preparing to deliver a powerful and unexpected blow. The blow was so strong that the man flew through the wall of the second floor, not having time to protect himself from it. Smiling, the ill-wisher did not understand why they were treating him so rudely. The man called our hero an ill-mannered young man because he dared to attack a defenseless guest. The enemy was silent, a cold smile on his face. The man noted that Jack would not be a good friend to his Charlotte, and therefore it is necessary to teach the young man and give him a good lesson. Suddenly the man stopped, saying that he felt some kind of weak magic. After that, the teacher made the dragon introduce itself, but the man thought it was some kind of toy talking. The witch noted that if the two lords were removed, there would be only 5 dragons left in the forest, but there was no man, meaning he was born 200 years ago. The opponent listened attentively to what was said to him but remained silent. The man's eyes were wide open and he was smiling, but it was hard to tell anything from his expression. But suddenly the dragon got angry. He asked how the toy knew this and who this girl was, trying to figure everything out. When Jack heard his mentor being called a toy and a girl, he became furious. The witch asked to let her go because she could handle it herself, emphasizing that she was a sorceress from the past. The young man had no intention of disobeying his mentor, and so he did as she asked. Standing in front of the enemy, the girl stated her full name. The witch was an immortal necromancer in the Time Village, but the man did not believe it, thinking that it was all nonsense. The interlocutor replied that there was no mistake. That was how it was called in ancient times. The enemy refused to believe it, saying that the doll had made it all up to look more respectable. But the next minute, the man heard the words Bahamut and Balamoth. The woman named the real names of the two lords, and now the stranger believed her, because only a few could know this. With melancholy in his voice, the ill-wisher stated out loud that he understood that Milos was not lying. The man stated that he was also a dragon, and his name was Valactus Machiavelli. The ill-wisher did not think that he would be able to meet such a face in an inconspicuous village. He only wanted to play with the second toy, after the death of the first. Suddenly, the witch ordered Valactus to leave, but the opponent emphasized that the woman had forgotten a lot. The dragon surpassed the humans in everything and won, and these unfortunate people had no choice but to flee. The man said that he believed that the witch was no one to order him around. The mentor did not agree with this opinion because she knew the truth, unlike her opponent. Valentine said that it was she who did it, not the dragons, surprising the nobleman, who was confident in the greatness of his race. The enemy looked at his interlocutor in surprise and again did not believe what she was telling him. It was Valentine who then divided humans and dragons, due to the latter's deep self-conceit. The situation was extremely tense, but no one wanted to change anything. The world began to come apart at the seams and could very soon come to an end. But the dragons stubbornly continued to believe that they were better than others, and therefore they committed outrages. Valactus commanded the mentor to stop talking nonsense, because she couldn't possibly know anything about the past. The man looked attentively at the people who stood below in silence. Meanwhile, Jack called him a lizard and emphasized that he should listen more and not talk. The young man didn't understand why. If the man was so cool, he was so scared when he heard the name of his mentor. At this point, Valactus's patience ran out. He called the guy a fearless freak, and said that he would show him where he belongs. A moment later, the enemy showed his claws, preparing to strike. The young man watched everything that was happening, but he was not going to do anything rash. Although less than a minute later, the young man pushed off the ground with his hands. Jack began to use a combat technique, realizing that there was not a minute to lose. Our hero kicked the man in the chin, causing him to fly back. The blow caused the opponent to hit the wall very hard. The man was in pain, he was not going to hide it, and so he began to scream and swear very loudly. The opponent knew that he couldn't give in to weakness, and so he began to slowly rise from his seat. Lifting Valactus's chin with the tip of his boot, the young man warned him not to dare to think himself better than his mentor. But the enemy did not calm down, saying that he was a dragon, and therefore better than everyone else, because people were real nobodies. The guy said, "If he continues to behave unkindly, Jack will simply kill him." Suddenly the man grabbed the boy by the leg and threw him back, because he didn't like that he was covering himself with Valentine Milos's back and considered himself better than him. The mentor watched what was happening carefully, but had no intention of interfering. Charlotte was the most surprised of all. She was in tears, trying to understand what was going on. The boy, as if nothing had happened, stood up and said that if Ron had seen how dirty the gentleman was, he would have fainted. Turning towards his new acquaintance, our hero was about to say something. The young man looked at Charlotte and declared that her uncle was the last non-entity on this earth. The girl started crying again. She couldn't say a word, but there was no need. The guy thought about what he could do in such a situation. And then he silently took the blonde by the hand and led her to look at Valactus, explaining that it was a real scumbag. Jack said that this man killed their kind, destroyed her father, and played with her mother until her death. And again, the unfortunate girl wanted to say something, but could not. And after that, the young man said that Vivian had given an answer, but he needed the young lady's permission. The guy pointed to the sword that was in the case. Let's see what he meant. And then he said again that the final word still remains with Charlotte, who must decide for herself what to do. The young man emphasized with a smile that he would show how responsible he could be and how much strength he had. Our hero jumped up again and was ready to strike, proving his words. For a moment, the young man hung in the air, choosing the best moment to attack. Jack moved closer and almost touched his face with his sword, trying to cause harm. Valactus easily jumped back, dodging the attack, looking at his opponent with confidence. For some time, the ill-wisher studied his opponent, wanting to find his weaknesses. The same goes for the guy who looked at Valactus with a stern gaze. Not even a few minutes had passed, and our hero had already jumped up from his seat. The rivals rushed at each other to decide who was stronger. This did not happen because the men came together in the fight and then separated. The enemy hoped that the guy's skills would be better, but his technique turned out to be ordinary and easy. Suddenly, Valactus was surprised. He did not realize when his hair was cut above his shoulders that it fell to the floor. After Jack's remark that the guy didn't want to ruin his face, Valactus became angry and emphasized that he wouldn't hold back. There was real rage in the enemy's eyes. He understood that he would do everything to destroy the young man. The ill-wisher cast a spell, using mana at full power to punish the impudent youth. The guy was surprised to see a powerful force rushing towards him. There were only a few seconds left. However, the young man blocked the blow with his sword and pretended that nothing had happened, without even blinking. Valactus couldn't understand how our hero was able to repel the dragon's attack. The mentor watched her protege with an impassive look. As before, she had no intention of interfering. Our hero understood that he had to act, and so he prepared to attack again. The young man looked closely into the frightened eyes of his opponent. Without giving the ill-wisher a chance to come to his senses, Jack had already flown up to him, put his hand on his face, and knocked him down. The enemy lay on the ground, unable to do anything. The young man himself remained standing, but the man screamed in pain with his last breath. Jack realized that he couldn't figure out if Valactus Machiavelli was the son of Luca from the Forest of Monsters. He, in turn, asked fearfully how the guy knew his father, since he had hardly seen him in person. The young man explained with a smile that Luca Machiavelli was one of the 5 dragons that controlled the monster forest. In his past life, it was our hero who cut off his head, but he didn't see his son. thinking that someone had killed him or that he was hiding somewhere. Valactus was stunned, his body shaking with fear and confusion, but he wanted to know who the teenager was. Jack replied that he was the first and last disciple of Valentine Milos, whom Valactus mocked. With despair in his eyes, the enemy thought about how an ordinary guy could stop his magic. And our hero thought about the fact that in front of him was a dragon, the most powerful creature in this world. Suddenly, the youth pointed the tip of the sword at the eye and gave 5 seconds to allow the man to apologize for everything he said about the mentor. The guy was ready to kill his opponent because he had offended the witch. Valactus asked what would happen if he refused and did nothing. The man received the answer that he would be ground into powder that no one would find. Jack was going to do to him what the man did to others because you have to be responsible for your actions. Our hero began to count down the seconds, and Valactus understood that his life was at stake, which both angered and frightened him. The ill-wisher looked into the witch's eyes, hearing the boy say that there were only 4 seconds left. Our hero did not take his eyes off the villain, waiting for him to make the right decision. Finally, the man flew up into the air, spreading his wings before the young man could kill him. The enemy was thinking that the situation had become much worse. Valactus knew he had to run and tell the other dragons. Jack looked up, watching the man run away, but he thought it was impossible. Taking a fighting stance, the guy began to accumulate mana, although he did not want to go that far, but he had no choice. The young man cast a spell of one of the 4 techniques called Heaven. The enemy watched what was happening in horror. He did not believe that the young man was capable of something like this. A magical vortex appeared in the sky in front of Valactus, making him nervous because he didn't understand what it was. Our hero was not going to give up, and so he recited the spell again and again, aimed at stopping the villain. With horror in his eyes, the enemy tried to understand what was happening and how far it would go. He wondered who he was dealing with, because he had never seen such strength, especially from a minor. The man found himself in some space and began to run in the hope of returning to the real world. However, he did not understand why he could not get out, because the space seemed to repeat itself wherever he went. A large likeness of Jack loomed over Valactus, frightening him and causing him to make rash decisions. The only solution was to run again, but not to stop for a moment. Each new step was difficult. It seemed that there was no way out and never had been. Eventually, the offender fell, trying to escape the huge shadow of the young man. Suddenly, the teenager's huge hand reached out to the offender to pin him down and punish him for all his thefts and impudent behavior. Jack suddenly woke up, looking around the room in surprise. The guy didn't understand how he ended up in a room on a large bed, because the last time he was outside. The young man stood up a little and tried to remember what had happened to him. Ron entered the room and asked what had happened to the owner, as he had just woken up. There was silence for a moment. The butler looked closely at the young master, but decided not to say anything. Our hero, with amazement in both his eyes and voice, asked if it was really his servant standing before him. The young man did not expect to see the butler approaching and asking if the boy recognized him. Covering himself with his hand, the teenager noted that firstly, he was not a child, and secondly, why was the butler in this house? The interlocutor thought, deciding what the young man should know. Jack wondered if the butler had seen the girl and the toy that were with him, fearing that he had lost them. Ron explained that the girl had been washed and put to bed in the next room. The butler did not know what had happened to her, but she was in despair because she was crying a lot. The servant realized that something terrible had happened, although he did not understand what exactly. Jack asked again about the toy, to which the man pointed to the mentor who was sitting on the sofa. The witch was in some confusion and embarrassment, but remained silent. To lighten the mood a little, our hero smiled at the girl. The boy wished her good morning, and the teacher sternly replied that it was already evening, surprising Ron, who did not expect her to talk. Valentine was unhappy because the young man suffered a lot, which she did not like at all. The young man laughed, noting that nothing serious had happened, and therefore the witch should not worry. The butler asked again whether the hostess was really talking to him, since she had not moved for 3 days. He was confused, but the young man said that he would explain everything later and that he should not worry. The guy warned that this was his mentor, and Ron should be more careful when communicating with her. For a while, the servant was silent and looked attentively at the teenager. He, in turn, was sure that the owner had a reason to say so, and therefore he would be careful. Jack asked to tell what happened then, in the hope of at least somehow understanding the situation. It all started with our hero dealing with a group of guards who were going to destroy him. After the knights accompanying the third son were found dead, the Marquis learned of this. Jack's father hired knights to sort out the situation and track down the young man. It wasn't that difficult to do this because the young man introduced himself more than once. Besides this, many people saw the guy in the province of Arbiola. Subsequently, rumors appeared that the young man had appeared in the province of Osenbul, where the knights had arrived. They saw a large funnel in the sky created by Mana, which helped them find the young man. After this, Jack was found on the ground, where he lay unconscious for a long time. No one knew what condition the teenager was in, but the wounds were very serious, so the boy was moved here and began to be treated. They had to use 3 premium strawberry-flavored elixirs. The young man liked that everyone remembered that he liked strawberries. Our hero liked everything, but he didn't understand why the servant was here and not protecting his sister as he promised. Scratching his ear, the young man timidly began to make excuses. He explained that the girl also wanted to go looking for him, but the Marquis stopped her, not letting her go, and sent Ron instead. The guy looked at his interlocutor in amazement and asked him if the gentleman had really given such an order personally. Jack called his father a fool for sending Ron here without understanding the consequences. The guy was glad to see the butler, whom he had already missed. But then he noticed a red-haired man who was standing and watching everything that was happening, wondering who this person was. The man emphasized that finally the third lord woke up, looking at him with surprise and incomprehension. He explained that his name was Gonzalez and that he was the second in command of the Knights of Blood. The boy assumed that the young man had already learned from his servant that he was the one responsible for the investigation. The knight wondered if the Marquis's son knew that he was not allowed to travel through the provinces and play with the local common people. Of course, the third heir may be allowed to do so, but the boy is still the Marquis's son. Ron began to defend the boy, but Jack stopped him because he wanted to listen to the second in command. With a smile on his face, the knight said that he would like to ask a few questions and hoped that the teenager would answer honestly. Jack thought about the fact that this man bought him 3 elixirs. Clenching his fist, the young man decided that he could withstand exactly 3 questions. With calmness in his voice, our hero stated that the deputy commander could ask questions since he was ready to answer. Gonzalez noticed the young man's gaze and did not understand why he was looking at him like that. The knight was curious about what happened at the place where all the knights were killed, because the young man was the only survivor. Jack explained that his guards had received strange orders to cripple him, and then he gave him the elixir to drink. And before he could finish speaking, he asked the man why he was looking at him like that. The interlocutor's eyes were full of horror as the guy asked if this was really the first time he was hearing about this. Gonzalez, with a businesslike air, asked not to change the subject and to continue the story. Still clenching his fist, the teenager thought about how he was barely holding back from being rude and continued the story. The boy said that the knights smiled evilly and said that the young man should understand them. The travelers were to stop for 4 nights on the way to the academy, and all this time, the knights planned to break his bones and then heal him with elixirs in the morning. Jack said that there was also a 6th-class knight, but he couldn't remember his name, to which the man noted that his name was Rajon. The guy emphasized that he was very self-confident and was going to destroy our hero's mana circle. The butler began to ask in horror what the young gentleman was talking about. When Ron noticed this, Jack stated that he simply went and killed the enemy. The deputy commander, listening to all this, did not believe that this was possible, and so he began to say something, but could not find the words. Our hero, getting up from his seat, asked whether his interlocutor had gone deaf or forgotten what he wanted to say. Without waiting for an answer, the teenager began to laugh and again said that he had killed everyone who wanted to harm him. Gonzalez looked at the young man, thinking to himself how a defenseless boy could single-handedly wipe out the entire squad. The man thought that this couldn't happen, and therefore it was all fiction. And so he said that he could turn a blind eye to many things, but not to the impudent person. The teenager looked at his angry interlocutor and said that he was wrong to think that way. Gonzalez stressed that the boy was probably bullying him and warned that if his sister didn't love him, he wouldn't turn a blind eye to it. The butler was frightened, and so, taking the knight by the hand, asked him to go out into the corridor and discuss everything face to face. Ron tried to calm the man down, but he didn't like that someone was touching him and started shouting that a servant had the right to do something like that. The young man, hearing this, opened his eyes wide in surprise. A moment later, the guy flew up and hit Gonzalez in the face hard enough to make him treat his friend with respect. The man flew towards the door, landing loudly on the floor, feeling the full force of the third heir. Jack angrily reported that he had restrained himself 3 times from punching the scoundrel for his attitude. For a moment, all 3 were silent, each in his place. The butler began to ask fearfully what the young master was doing. Ron then began to calm the boy down, reminding him that he was sick and that he shouldn't be so tense. The guy lay down on the bed, making the servant even more worried because he did not understand what was wrong with him. The young master said that he was just feeling dizzy and there was no need to worry so much. The guy also noted that the man has the 7th circle. Smiling, Our hero continued to talk about how surprising it was that a knight with such powers would mock an ordinary servant. Ron started to smile. He was pleased that the guy cared about him. Suddenly, Jack grabbed the butler by the collar and asked him not to live the way he had lived before. And a minute later, he added that he had been too stupid before. The boy thought that it would be much easier with Ron around, but now he thinks differently. Ron was one of his own people, so the teenager wanted him to live like a human being. After which the butler noted that the guy had never spoken like that before. Jack looked at the man with pity and asked if he really didn't want to change anything. The servant began to smile, noting that, of course, he wanted something new and normal. The butler rose from his seat and turned to Gonzalez, declaring that he was the third most powerful of them all. And even though the young gentleman didn't really recognize him yet, he himself remembers everything perfectly. Jack asked how much time his friend needed, offering 5 minutes to deal with Gonzalez. The young man smiled but said nothing. Everyone knows that Ron is a great cook, and talking about food here is completely inappropriate. The point is in another very important moment. This became clear when looking at the actions of the man, who skillfully dodged the knight's attacks. Moreover, the butler not only managed to maneuver perfectly, but he also dealt blows to his offender. The servant hits him in cold blood, knocking out several teeth without even flinching. It seemed that for the first time in all this time, the servant could finally show himself and declare what he was capable of. The deputy commander did not like this, because he considered the butler stupid for swinging at him. The young man was experienced in such matters, and therefore parried the blow perfectly. Ron easily landed a punch to the chest, sending the man screaming in pain flying. The servants gathered in the corridor, as well as the guards, could not understand what was happening in the room, but did not dare to interfere. Jack watched this and felt that these actions were already familiar to him. The young man was proud of his assistant, realizing that he was very strong. Of course, the boy had seen Ron fight before, remembering his past life. Our hero recalled one incident when the butler defended him while the young man curled up on the ground and covered his head with his hands. At this very time, his faithful assistant was doing what seemed to be completely incredible things. But even at the 9th circle, his main strength was not magic, but physical strength. And that's why even now the guy sat with a serious look and watched the butler. Our hero thought about it. Isn't it surprising that Gonzalez, a 7th circle magician, loses to Ron, a simple servant? Of course, the knight has a lot of experience in close combat with stronger guys. Jack wondered if it was possible to tell that the man was an imperial spy, so the servant would have to kill, although it was unlikely that Ron would be able to do that. Suddenly, Gonzalez snatched a sword from one of the knights, knocking him down in surprise. The enemy threatened the butler, telling him to die, because there is no mercy for the impudent man. That is why our hero's faithful friend raised his hand to instinctively protect himself from the blow. The man didn't have time to swing his sword as Ron approached him, placing his hand on his back. A second later, the butler's knee hit the knight in the face. Jack understood that the butler had to hide his true strength precisely because of him, his young master. At this point, the ill-wisher began to wipe his mouth, thinking about what to do next. The young gentleman turned to Ron as he looked at the exhausted Gonzalez. The butler turned around with a smile and asked what the young man wanted. The guy asked how long he would have to wait for food. The man looked at the guy in surprise, trying to understand what they were talking about. The next minute, Ron quickly realized what the boy wanted. While from behind, the knight tried to strike the man. In a matter of seconds, the butler clenched his fist in his hand and used magic to fulfill Jack's request, knocking out his opponent. Gonzalez lay unconscious, and the guy noted that 1 minute and 20 seconds had passed, and Ron needed to try to be faster. The young man, seeing the knights watching all this, angrily sent them to work. The guy grabbed the offender by the hair and suggested that they now talk face to face. The young master noted that the man had a cool name and good skills, and his father trusted him. Despite the pain, the ill-wisher began to say something about our hero, as well as his butler. The guy added that perhaps the man didn't understand yet, but the young man wasn't expecting a direct answer. Jack asked if the knight had come here to find out what had happened, and a moment later, he added that now he knew about everyone who was behind this. And then he continued to note that this was the Marquis's favorite, the 3rd knight, the captain's deputy. It would be a shame to simply kill someone like that. Suddenly, our hero quietly asked if the opponent would like to have an 8th circle and become a captain. Looking at the frightened ill-wisher, the young man repeated his question once again. The guy emphasized that they could come to an agreement, but the knight still looked lifelessly at the young master and remained silent. However, Ron realized that the gentleman was up to something. The servant thought to himself that he was proud of him, because the boy had already grown up. The butler was approached by a mentor who poked him in the leg to attract the man's attention.